All righty. What is going on, YouTube? Thank you, everybody, for joining. Today, we have a special guest on the channel, and we're going to be trying out a reaction video to an ethics debate. It's the first time we've actually done a reaction video as opposed to an actual debate on the channel. So I am really looking forward to this. We have a professional ethics philosopher here with us, Lance Bush, who has humbly agreed to do a critique on this. When I first listened to this debate, I was very shocked at how much I disagreed with the realist point of view, even though I consider myself a moral realist. So I'm going to have Lance, probably the most knowledgeable anti-realist I know and have seen, give his views on that. So Lance, thank you for joining us, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Okay. So I do philosophy and psychology. So I do an interdisciplinary sort of thing. And I'm actually a psychology instructor currently, and my PhD is in psychology, but I did do a master's in philosophy, and I mix the two. Some people may have heard of this sort of growing field over the past 20 years or so called experimental philosophy. A lot of my work is in there. And that's basically frequently looks at how non-philosophers respond to traditionally philosophical questions so that we could get a better understanding of how people without philosophical training think about philosophical issues. And that could give us insights into both philosophy and psychology. So I combine the two, and a big part of my emphasis in both areas is meta-ethics. Is that is a branch of philosophy that deals with abstract questions about the nature of morality. But I look at the nature of morality both from a philosophical and a psychological perspective.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that intro. No, I think that makes a really unique it's like stance that you have, a really unique insight that you have with your psychology background. I've spent a lot. I don't know if you're a fan of Jordan Peterson or not, but he's a pretty well-known psychologist. And that's kind of where I first got my grounding in looking into how psychology influences society, or how like the study of psychology has, and how you can kind of not conflate the two, but like how they can affect one another. Ultimately, you will have some sort of connection to morality and psychology. I think that's pretty cool. Have you ever looked at any of his stuff in regards to that, or no?
I'm only aware of him as a sort of public intellectual, and I've
Okay.
seen some of his debates and interviews, but I'm not familiar with any like substantive details of his perspectives on anything. I can say I'm well aware he's a polarizing figure, and um, also his approach and perspective on things is so distant from mine in terms of the sort of content he consumes and the sorts of things that he says that it's almost a different area. Like we don't read the same stuff basically.
Right.
So I couldn't, without really doing a deeper dive into that stuff, I just wouldn't be able to evaluate it. It's just you might be surprised at how much people that seem to be addressing similar things from similar backgrounds are actually addressing them in very, very different ways.
Well, I mean, he's more into the political side of things, so definitely not into meta ethics. So I guess I'm not that surprised. I think his clinical work and things he did in the past just don't really see the light like his political content does. So it's kind of a shame. But um, either way, so tell us about your new promotion here. You got a new job working at Cornell. How's that
Mhm.
working out for you?
Well, I just started last week, and actually did my PhD in psychology at Cornell. I was away for a
Okay.
few years, and now I'm back. So that I don't know how typical that is. I don't think it's that common, but yeah, it's great to be back. I'm excited to be here. Yeah, so I'm working as an instructor, and it just started. So it's going well so far, and we'll see how it goes.
Nice. Okay. Well, congrats again. That's awesome.
Yeah, thanks.
Um, and we'll see your name as like the director of ethics over there at Cornell. You like 5, 10 years. But either way, let me go ahead and pull this debate up on the screen. So, in this discussion, Alex O'Connor is defending the view called emotivism, which you're more than familiar with. And then Craig Biddle is defending a view called egoism, which I don't think I've ever heard anybody defend egoism before until listening to him. And he calls it rational egoism. Is there a difference between egoism and rational egoism? Or do you
Well, I
know?
don't know if there's probably a technical distinction between the two, but I should say from my brief familiarity with seeing the first part of this video before, I barely remember it. My understanding is that Biddle is defending like Ayn Rand's perspective on the matter, and
Yeah.
so my impression would be that the specific form of egoism he's defending is a distinctively Randian perspective on it, and there's almost certainly like non-Randian perspectives. And I would guess that whatever distinction there would be, it would be whatever differences there are between Rand's perspective and whatever non-Randian perspectives are out there. I should say though that egoism is typically falls more within the scope of normative ethics, and I'm not a normative ethicist. I don't really do like I wrote essays as an undergrad on that stuff, but it's not stuff that I work on sort of academically. You're not going to see a lot of stuff from me talking about normative ethics. So
Gotcha.
that puts me at some disadvantage in that I'm not a specialist in that particular topic, and I'm even less familiar with Ayn Rand's work. The only thing I've read from Ayn Rand is Atlas Shrugged. That's it. I haven't read anything else. And Rand is not popular in academic philosophy. Her work is often treated with a certain degree of contempt. There are people that defend her views, but it's not well received, and it's not typically studied at the university level. So it's not something you're likely to get a whole lot of exposure to, except under special circumstances, like if someone specifically wants to review her work for whatever reason.
Okay. Can I ask why it's not well received, I guess, in the community? Do you know why?
Sorry, you cut out there a little bit. Are you asking why people have that attitude towards Ayn Rand?
Right. Yeah.
I couldn't tell you. I mean, it could be. I could speculate. Part of it might be that people find they don't like her political views. Part of it could be that they don't like her normative moral views. Part of it could be attitudes about the quality of her scholarship. So, whereas she may have claimed that her ideas are original, critics have said that they're not so original. They're actually a derivative of the work of scholars that she didn't properly attribute her sort of inspiration to. So people might just think she's bad at arguing for her perspective. So there's a variety of reasons why people might dislike her that I could speculate on. But I would just be curious to ask people, why do you dislike Ayn Rand? I would be really curious about the general perspective philosophers take on pretty much anybody. That I really like that kind of meta research. Why do philosophers think about this sort of thing?
Gotcha. Can you still hear me? I don't know why I came
I
off
can.
screen. Okay. Well, I think that's a great cue while I'm getting this fixed. Let's go ahead and show. Let's see. Let's get the debate on screen. My camera is just deciding to reset for some reason. Okay. All right. So we're going to go ahead and play this introductory. It's not the whole intro to Alex's part, but or to his intro rather. It's just going to be like part of the intro. I wanted to kind of hear. Basically, he's kind of getting into the gist of why he's an emotivist, and then from there, get your reaction to that, and then we'll go into Biddle's intro. All right. So let's go ahead and get this rolling.
To be clear, if you were to say murder is wrong, I think the best way of getting at what your meta-ethics is to translate that into a different phrase that doesn't use the word wrong and see what you're actually trying to say. So murder is wrong, that might translate as something like, I don't like murder. That's not emotivism. That's moral subjectivism. Because to say I don't like murder is just to report a fact. It's just a fact. It's a true fact about my brain that I don't like murder. And so me saying murder is wrong, reporting that, would just be making a claim about my psychology. That's not what emotivism is. Emotivism says that when you say murder is wrong, you are expressing the dislike itself. So saying murder is wrong is not the same thing as saying I don't like murder. It's expressing the dislike. So A.J. Ayer famously had it as murder is wrong translates roughly to something like boo murder. You can think of it as the difference between saying murder and saying murder is wrong is like the difference between writing down murder and then writing down murder with an exclamation mark and an angry emoji. It adds something, it tells you something about the mental state of the person you're speaking to, but it doesn't add anything propositional. It doesn't change, it's not the kind of thing that can be true or false. This is the most radical thing about emotivism. It means that moral claims don't have truth value. They can't be true and false. The emotivist recognizes that if you pay attention to what's going on when you have a moral feeling, when you see a homeless person being kicked for no reason, what happens in your brain? Well, you've seen a set of objective facts. You can say a person has been kicked. That's true. It doesn't do anything moral. You could say, I don't like that this person has been kicked. That's reporting a psychological fact. Again, nothing moral, you're just stating facts. But there's this added element, there's this added thing that you feel, and it's something like don't. It's something like stop. It's something like boo. All of these things are not things that can have truth value. They're emotions. One of the ways that I would describe this is to imagine that we didn't have a word for anxiety, the feeling of anxiety. Imagine there was just no such.
All right. So, and that part right there, I forgot to ask you about this in the beginning, um, but this is an interesting view. I don't know anybody other than I guess AJ Ayers who defends emotivism. But what are your thoughts on that? Like, have you looked into Ayers' work on emotivism at all, or?
Yeah, I'm familiar. I haven't read. It's the sort of thing where a lot of the exposure you get is going to be secondary sources, and I haven't spent a lot of time directly reading Ayer. I know people that have. I do think it's something that I should have done, and I just haven't done. So someone could wag their finger at me and tell me I should be digging more into historical works and not rely so much on secondary sources. I think a few years ago I would have dismissed that and said, nah, the primary sources are usually unclear, and secondary sources are better. But what I've started to discover is that a lot of secondary sources misrepresent what people have said. They oversimplify it. They pick out some things rather than other things. And myths and narratives can emerge in the philosophical literature that misconstrue what people say. So there's a good chance if I go and read Ayer, I have a sense I'm gonna like a lot of what I discover there. As far as emotivism has become the sort of a poster child for representing non-cognitivism, or these days people usually use the term expressivism. And when I do see non-cognitivism, it typically appears in like intro books and with historical reference to people in the past. Ayer certainly was this big representative of the emotivist, non-cognitivist or expressivist position. Another very prominent one who isn't discussed as frequently, but is mildly alluded to in Alex's description is R.M. Hare. So emotivists treat moral claims as non-propositional and as expressing emotions like boo. There's also yay, like if you think something's good, like yay, helping people. Whereas Hare has a few other components. There's this universality component, but one really key component there, and you see that he mentions this, I wrote down a couple of the words. He said, yeah, like don't and stop. Notice that an exclamation like ow or yay or boo, those express attitudes or feelings or emotions, hence emotivism, whereas the other ones, stop, don't, those express imperatives. That's like a command. Like if I say, shut the door. No, shut the door is also not a proposition. It can't be true or false, but it's also not merely an expression of an emotion. It's actually a command. And that's another way that you can have a type of non-cognitivism, is to have a type of prescriptivism, where moral claims, they don't express propositions, nor do they only express some sort of non-propositional emotional content. They actually involve commands at the very least. So that's another perspective, and he does allude to that. And sometimes I've seen him mention this before. He kind of mentions both, but doesn't explicitly talk about that type. So yeah, those are two of the sort of early non-cognitivist positions on the table. These days, things have gotten a lot more complicated as people have started incorporating deflationary views of truth and a bunch of other components. Those are hard to compress and summarize. They take a lot of exposition to lay out what exactly is going on with those positions and what's motivating them. But those are the sort of neo-expressivist views. Those would be tough to try to summarize. But he's not defending that. He's actually defending, I guess you could say, like a classical or old school non-cognitivism. So, and actually, as far as his description goes, I thought that was a great description. I thought he gave a very good description, and pointing out the contrast, the difference between like murder boo and I disapprove of murder. And right. his initial claim about how it's a good approach is to translate the sentence, like murder is wrong, translate it into murder boo or don't murder or I don't like murder. I use that approach all the time. So I thought his explanation was great. It seems on point to me. Maybe someone that's an Ayer scholar would think that there's problems with it. But as far as a sort of basic introduction to a non-cognitivist perspective, that looked great to me.
Okay. What are your thoughts on non-cognitivism?
So I'm not a non-cognitivist. I don't endorse, there's three traditional anti-realist positions, and non-cognitivism is one of them. My main concern with it is not the standard concerns that people have. So the most common objection that you'll see in the literature to something like emotivism is there's like the Frege-Geach problem. We don't need to get into the technicalities of it. The simple way of putting it is, hey, if you go out and you look at the way that people use moral language, they seem to use it in ways that makes the most sense or only makes sense if they're treating that language as propositional. So it would be a little weird to insert emotions into the premises of an argument, because someone might say something like, hey, look, like misreporting your taxes is basically stealing. Stealing is wrong. So it's wrong to misreport your taxes, something like that. You're inserting like a claim about what's morally right or wrong into a pattern of inference. It would be really weird if it was just expressing an emotion or a command, because premises to arguments are propositions. So it seems like it functions as a proposition. We also someone might pause and go, is it really true that stealing is wrong? It would be a little weird. Sometimes people will parody this by saying, well, is it really the case that boo stealing? That sounds strange. So if it were functioning in a way where it only expressed emotion, if you go and you look at paradigmatic things that people say when it comes to morality, it seems like it doesn't account for those uses very well. So the short version is, there seem to be ways in which we use moral language that seem really, really inconsistent or difficult to account for if you endorse a non-cognitive view. That's a standard sort of objection. I don't buy into that objection myself, because the presumption here behind this sort of objection is that when people are employing moral language, that there is a single rigid way, semantics to their language. So all sort of, you could say like exemplars, all sort of perfect representations or fundamental representations of moral claims, because there's like really complex ways people might say something that you would consider moral expression. Just take something like stealing is wrong, like a very prototypical one. Sure, you can insert that in context where it seems to function as a proposition, but we also use language like that in non-propositional contexts, at least I think we do. And so I think that the way that language works is that sentences don't have distinct, rigid, or fixed meanings, but rather their meanings emerge in their contexts of usage. And it's not so much that the sentence itself has a meaning, but that the speaker of the sentence is using the sentence for some purpose. They're expressing their meaning. The slogan I use for this is, words don't mean things, people mean things. And so when we're asking the question of what people are doing with moral language, on my view, it becomes an empirical question. So you could sit there from the armchair and say, hey, look, I can imagine sentences where it looks like language is functioning in a propositional way. Okay, but those are imaginary sentences. And, I've mocked this view by saying this is kind of like, if you went to a zoo, you looked at a tiger, you went home, you sat down in a chair, and you imagined tiger behavior in your head. And then you wrote like a zoological report on tiger behavior. Oh, tigers do this, tigers do that. From the tiger you're imagining. That's not good enough. If you actually want to understand tigers, you got to go observe them, and you have to observe them in their natural habitats. And I mean this literally with language. The only way to understand how people use moral language is to study moral language literally in its natural habitat. You need to actually study non-philosophers speaking and using moral discourse in real world contexts. And the question I would want to ask in those cases is, what are they trying to do? What are they trying to achieve there? Because all the armchair reasoning in the world can't be a substitute for an empirical question, for actual empirical evidence. And so, you can imagine, what if we did a study, and you could do this where people will carry a little recorder with them. There's probably huge issues with that because you'd be recording people all around you, but they've done this before. So imagine you did this, or imagine you had some effective means of monitoring everything a person said. You could pull out all the stuff they say that's moral stuff, and you determined that 90 or 95% of the time in practice, when people made moral claims, they were not inserting them into arguments like assassination is a type of murder, all types of murder are wrong, therefore assassination. No one is going around giving syllogisms. That's not a thing people do. But what if most of the time people were like, that's wrong? Like they seem to be using it in an expressive way, like Alex's emotivism. Okay, so it seems like the primary use and function of morality is to express emotions. So you have that, I think, would present the moral philosopher with a dilemma. So either they would have to say, okay, it doesn't matter if almost always in practice, when people make moral claims, they're expressing emotions and not propositions. Emotivists are wrong anyway, in which case their position isn't contingent on ordinary usage. That's a little weird. Alternatively, what are they going to say? Okay, well, then those aren't instances of moral claims. Like that. Okay, so most of the time, no one's making moral claims. It just never happens. That also seems kind of ridiculous. So I see this. I don't know. There's no like formal name for this, but you could call it the empiricist dilemma. You could either say this isn't an empirical question, in which case, okay, what's it about then? Or it is an empirical question, in which case they appear to me like they're mistaken in principle, contingent on empirical findings. Basically the too long didn't read version of this is I take these questions to be empirical questions. Traditional critiques of emotivist positions are in no way empirical at all. They don't look at any actual data or any actual usage. And so I just don't, I'm not going to accept them. I want to see the data.
That's really surprising. I just figure, and I've heard you say before that I guess the less armchair side of things, like empirical side of things, hasn't been as popular. That's like in the last 20 years that's gotten more popular, which it's just surprising to me, especially with how fast like science has moved in all the fields of science. Like why on the other side with philosophy we haven't done that, but um, I guess it's better than doing it now rather than never. But the data is definitely uh, different, as opposed like from a empirical view as opposed to sitting back at the armchair.
Yeah, I don't know why it only started recently. And what's especially strange about this is if you look into 20th century metaethics, I've sometimes had people tell me, well, why does it matter what ordinary people mean when they make these claims? Why does semantic theses matter? Why would this be an empirical question? And people have suggested, well, maybe philosophers like Mackey or Hare or Ayer aren't really talking about what ordinary people mean when they make moral claims. But you could just pull quotes. There's a great paper called Mixed Up Metaethics. I think Senator Armstrong is the author that just catalogs a list of these quotes. I found a few of my own where they'll say things. These philosophers will say things like, "When I provide this semantic thesis, I mean to capture what the ordinary person means when they're sitting on the bus." Like they're very explicit that their theory is in part a theory about what people out there are trying to do when they talk. And so I'm puzzled when people say they're not even trying to do that. They explicitly say they're trying to do that. And yet, this is stuff you'll find a quote from like the 1950s or a person saying that. No one did it. It's not like no one did any empirical research on this at all, pretty much. And yet they're making claims that seem to me to be obviously empirical. Why didn't they think they needed to do empirical research? It's totally baffling to me. I don't get it at all.
It's like that intuition thing we were talking about earlier. People think that intuitively, because I think also it's, I mean, as someone who's not educated in psychology, I can only think it's kind of like, well, if I think it's intuitive and my friends think it's intuitive, well, then that probably is intuitive. But that's just, that's he said, she said. That's at best anecdotal. That's not empirical data. But yeah.
Yeah, you would think philosophers would know better than to rely on anecdotes, or it seems this way to me, so it must seem that way to everybody. It's just, I just find that such a bizarre inference to make. Why would you assume everybody thinks like you? I don't assume everyone thinks like me.
Yeah, no, that's a habit that anyone who's doing, and I found myself doing that before, and I try to make sure I don't do that and try to be as intellectually honest as possible, because it's always possible the data will go against me. So let's get back into this. Let's look at Biddle's opening statement, which I'm looking forward to hearing your response to. Again, this is a more of a normative ethics, but he does smuggle in a lot of meta ethics that seems, at least to me, kind of hard to justify from where he's coming from. But we will go from there, and I'm sure you're not going to disagree with that. Have you heard of Biddle before this, by the way?
I had not heard of Biddle before, no.
Okay, I hadn't either. Interesting. Well, let's see what he says.
We need moral, either we need evaluative terms like good, bad, should, shouldn't, right, wrong, or we don't. It's either or. And if we don't need them, then we should stop using them because they don't serve any purpose. If we do need them, then the reason why we need them is going to shed a lot of light on what their referents are in reality. The reason why we need them, the facts that give rise to our need of them, are going to tie them to reality. Those are the facts to which they refer. So, for instance, if I say that murder is wrong, I am using the term wrong there to refer to some fact in reality. What is that fact? And this is where Ayn Rand's, as many of you know, I'm an advocate of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. But this is where Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism comes in. And it comes in two ways. First of all, I'm going to discuss a little bit about how she anchored morality in reality by identifying the factual requirements of human life as the standard of moral value. And then I'm going to use what I term the Ayn Rand question, which you're going to hear me use repeatedly in this discussion, I think, and that is, what facts of reality give rise to the need of this term we are using? Either there are facts that support a term and make it necessary for us to communicate ideas, or there are no facts, in which case it's just an arbitrary term, we have no need for it. So why do we need evaluative terms? Why do we need the term value? What does it refer to? Well, Rand identifies the fact that a value, in the way that we use it, just in plain language, means something that you go after, something you act to gain or keep. You value money, you value an education, you value a relationship, an education, or if you're religious, you value God. So you go to church because you're after a relationship with God. So before we even have a standard of morality, value simply means objects that we go after, objects of action. And she says, well, why do things go after objects? Why does anything go after things like that? And she observes that only one kind of thing goes after objects, and that is living beings, right? And this is not just humans, but living beings in general, antelopes, cats, birds, and humans, and also flowers and trees, right? And what do? They go after something. If it's a tree, it burrows its roots into the ground, it turns its leaves toward the sky. If it's an antelope, it goes after its food and it runs away from the lion, and so forth. What's going on here? Only living things go after values, non-living things don't, right? So value, Rand says, is not a primary. It presupposes an answer to the question of value to whom and for what. So this contrasts with like A.J. Ayer, more specifically actually with G.E. Moore, who would hold that good is a primary, it's undefinable primary. Rand says it's not an undefinable primary. Good to whom and for what? If something is good, it has to have a being to whom it is good. And then there's got to be a reason why it's good. And Rand says the same about values. So she says only living things go after values. And then she says, well, the to whom is answered by the thing going after the value, right? Bird is going after a worm. The worm is value to the bird. Why is it going after the bird? What difference does it make if the worm doesn't get the worm? And Rand keeps going, and she says, if we keep looking at reality, at all the living things that go after values, what we see is that the reason they go after values is in order to remain alive. And she arrives at this very fundamental conclusion. There's only one fundamental alternative in the universe, existence or non-existence, and it pertains only to living organisms. A living thing can go out of existence, or its life can go out of existence. When something dies, that's what happens. Its chemical elements remain, but its life is gone. And she identifies that this is the very foundation that gives rise to the possibility of and the need of values. A thing can't go after values unless it's alive, and if it is to remain alive, it must go after values.
All right. So he pretty much kind of goes and elaborates a little further in there. So what are your thoughts, Lance?
Yeah, I actually like the way he starts this by basically saying, like, why are we asking these questions? What do we need? I do think that's a good way of addressing philosophical questions because it grounds them in something practical. Why are we talking about this? What do we need these terms for? I think a lot of philosophy goes off the rails when it's not grounded in something like what do we need this for? What's this? What are we doing this for? What's the purpose of this? So I don't have a huge issue with that. I actually think that's a good starting point. And as he's going through explaining all of this stuff, I'm not seeing nothing's jumping out at me right up until he gets to the point where he's describing Ayn Rand arrives at this conclusion that that the reason things go after values is in order to remain alive. He doesn't, and I could say the same of Alex. I don't recall Alex doing much to present an argument or a set of arguments for his emotivist position. It seems like he just explains the position. But explaining a position doesn't give an audience or me or anybody really any particular reason to endorse the position. And unless Craig does the same, later on, I feel the same way about this. Like, we're told Ayn Rand arrives at this conclusion. Okay, well, I've thought about this stuff and I didn't arrive at that conclusion. So what pattern of inference was their set of arguments or considerations? At this point, we're not told what they are. It's not, maybe it's supposed to be obvious. It's not obvious to me that things are only doing things, ultimately or fundamentally. Of course, things have instrumental goals. You don't, you eat because you're hungry, but, also hunger, satisfying your hunger is necessary to stay alive. So we can distinguish instrumental goals from fundamental goals. I don't think everything's fundamental goals to stay alive. I think, some organisms, there's animals where part of the male mating strategy, they die as a result. And so, so from an evolutionary perspective, for some organisms, the natural selection favored a set of behaviors that are not conducive to individual survival. They're conducive to the spread of that individual's genes at the expense of its own survival. And so even from just a sort of just brutally looking at what organisms do, natural selection does not favor survival directly. Survival from an evolutionary perspective is a means to an end. And the end is the spread of one's genes. And if an animal sacrificing itself will spread its genes to future generations, that will be selected for by natural selection. It is in the interests of, say, the parent of a large group of offspring to defend them and risk its life if that is likely to leave behind more copies of its genes. So looking at this from a purely biological perspective, this just doesn't sound right to me. And then also looking at it from a psychological perspective, are people fundamentally motivated by a desire to continue existing? I don't think so. A lot of people, it looks to me like human values are shaped by personality differences, individual differences. I'm sure evolution plays a role, but culture plays a role. At people and personal experience. It's not like every person in a culture has the same values and goals. There's individual differences within a culture. But all of these factors allow people have a certain degree of flexibility in what they end up valuing. People can have really weird values. People can have a stamp collection as one of their primary goals. And if I'm sure there's people that are such avid collectors that they're like, look, if you add this rare stuff to my collection, I don't care. If I only they trade years of their life, to add to their collection, in other words. And so that seems to show that they value things in a way that's not instrumental towards their own survival. So from both a psychological and a biological perspective, this just does not seem right to me.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, this is why, part of my moral stance, which is under construction at the moment, as a theist, I think and I know you've had different views on as far as does theism help realism? But I think in this case it does, because it gives, God, if God is the rule maker, we might be able to somehow justify that there is this ought, or this what he's trying to grab at for just existing, I think is better explained through theism. And so when I hear somebody like Biddle try to defend the ought, why do we have this feeling? I think he started out well, like you said, but then getting to the point to where we're like, well, it's just the need to survive. I mean, like you said, many animals like bees and other things, they choose not to survive, they sacrifice themselves for the greater good, or what they're instinctually made to do. So that just seems like opposite what we observe in nature. So that's kind of, and then survival in and of itself, what happens if one's survival depends on the non-survival of another, right? So if you have one piece of food and then two people they're fighting over it, you guys are going to fight to get over it. That doesn't mean you made like the moral decision there. So that's kind of one of the interesting things I see. That's why I always struggled with the naturalist realist view. To me, if theism is false, 100%, I would have to drop realism. 100%.
Yeah, I would note too, people like parents that don't have enough food will give food to their children and go hungry. The parents not trying to survive; they're trying to protect their children. You could put this in a religious context too. Many people are willing to die for their religion because they value it more than they value their own mortal life, because they don't even think their mortal life is the only life they're going to live. I mean, that's part of it. But even in case, like, people will die for secular causes where they don't think they have an afterlife. It's just, the bottom line is people can end up valuing all sorts of things and prioritizing them ahead of their own lives. At least it seems that way to me. And it would take a lot of work to convince me that, as a matter of psychological fact, it's not the case that there are any appreciable number of people that value things other than their own lives, like as their sort of number one priority.
Right. No, 100%. So let's go to the next timestamp here. Let's see where he's going to kind of continue on. The next part of the introduction, he's just continuing to kind of reiterate what he had already said. And then he goes a little bit deeper, starting to get into egoism here. All right. One day my mouse will work. There we go.
Say, but I want to pause. As to your concern that there's got to be an ought in here somewhere, Rand makes a really interesting distinction that I think helps with this. The normal way that people have thought about objectivity versus subjectivity has been that subjective means you just made it up, it's just in here, it's just arbitrary. And objective means it's out there somewhere. Like Plato's form of the good, right? That would be out there, or God in the Christian view. It's out there, and so you get the commandments, or you get a revelation. And Rand said this is a false alternative, and it's a really problematic way of thinking about what objective is. So she came up with a trichotomy, and she said there is the subjective, which is just sort of going by whims or whatever you feel like doing. There's the intrinsic, which is the term she uses for the idea that the good is out there, detached from human beings, detached from our cognitive needs and from our needs at all. And it just sort of imprints on us, and then we have to do it, God's commandments or something like that. And she says the proper way to use the concept of objective is that the objective is the connection between the mind in here and a fact out there. And in this case, what she's saying is, we are recognizing the fact that it is only life that makes the concept of values possible or necessary.
Okay. So what are your thoughts on that part?
First time hearing this. What I would say is that doesn't sound like a trichotomy, because I'm not understanding how the third one, if I was trying to divide up conceptual space, I might want to say, hey, there's three groups of objects. Some of them are blue, some are red, and some are yellow, or something like that. Or I'm pointing to some difference that's a qualitative difference, where I could say, here's how they all contrast with one another. Or I could say something is to the left, or it is not to the left, or it's to the right. But in this case, I'm not sure how this picks out, you can imagine a pie, and three different positions should take up like slices of the pie where they don't overlap. But it doesn't sound like this is three slices of the same pie. It just sounds qualitatively different. So I mean, maybe if I go read it or think about it more, I would see how these are contrasted with one another, but it's not obvious to me what distinction, is being made here. I should also say, I don't like that characterization of subjective. So subjective does not mean you just made it up. So take food preferences. Do I just make up my food preferences? I wake up in the morning, decide what I feel like I like the taste of? No, I discover what I like the taste of. When you try a new food, you don't decide whether you like it or not. You find out. So this idea that subjective is just like we make it up or we decide. I mean, he even used the term on a whim. No anti-realist that I've ever heard of decides their moral values on a whim. They're not just like, I
I know I'm normally against murder, but yeah, just to heck with it. Now it's okay. That's not how human values work. It's just not how they work. Subjective does not mean on a whim. It doesn't mean you just make it up. It doesn't even mean it's under voluntary control. All it means is it's a matter of your standards or values. Whether or not and to what extent your preferences, standards, or values are subject to voluntary control or can change on a whim is a psychological fact that could vary from one person to another. You can imagine, like, it's logically possible that one person has completely locked in preferences and values and they can't change them. It's logically possible a person can change them on a whim as much as they want. None of that is actually part of the concept of subjective. Subjective just means it is indexed to your standards. It doesn't say anything about the stability of the standards or how they arise. So this is a common mischaracterization of subjectivism. So that's part of a problem with this sort of a trichotomy, is that the subjective side of it seems to me to be treated as too weak of a position by baking in features of it that make it sillier and weaker than it actually is. As far as intrinsic, I don't have a huge problem with that. That sounds fine. I would prefer a cleaner, like if you're going to contrast views, I prefer stuff that's like it carves the conceptual space at its joints. This thing has this property, this thing does not have this property. But the way he's characterized them, it doesn't really do that. Like one is value is arbitrary, made up, and it's based on whims. The other is the good is out there, detached from human beings. But that's not very specific about the way in which it's independent of human beings. So the way in which I prefer to characterize things is to say that the moral facts in question are stance dependent or they're stance independent. And this is a pretty conventional way it's characterized in the academic literature. So the idea here would be that there are moral facts, and the moral facts can either be dependent on, they're made true by one's attitudes or values or preferences or whatever, or there are these facts and they're not made true by your attitudes or your values or your preferences or your cultures or whatever. And that distinction is stance dependent versus independent. And I like that because it's intended to pick out a dichotomy. Here, I'm not seeing a clear dichotomy. I'm not seeing a clear trichotomy. And to be fair, this is like a live recording. This isn't something where he's able to sit down and explain all of these in greater detail. So there could be pieces of the characterization that are missing. So I would just say this sounds a little unsatisfactory to me.
Okay. Yeah, I thought his characterization of it's always for a long time I made that mistake of thinking it's objective or subjective, and it really needs to be laid out as stance dependent or stance independent, because ultimately, if there are no minds, there's no morality, and then B, I think there's always that kind of I don't want to say straw man, but almost straw man view. Well, it's subjective. You just, like you said, you just made it up. It's arbitrary. It's like all anti-realists have to be moral relativists, which is not true. So that's like you said, the characterization not so good. But we'll keep going to the next timestamp. And which is funny because as Alex is literally explaining a position that doesn't match what he just said, and he's considered an anti-realist, but I don't know if he realizes that or not.
Yeah, I don't know if he does or not, but yeah, non-cognitivism is neither a form of realism or subjectivism.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if you realize that. That's kind of funny. All right, let's see. Go to the 18-minute mark. There we go.
If ethics requires the prospect of living and dying, that is to say that were you not a living being who could choose certain courses of action which would cause you to die, ethics cannot exist, if I understand you correctly?
Yes, she actually said that explicitly, that ethics applies, well, values apply only to living things, and ethics apply only to volitional living things.
Then I'd like you to imagine for a second an immortality pill that is discovered, invented by scientists, and perhaps to avoid some kind of overpopulation crisis, everybody sterilized at the discovery of this miraculous wonder drug. And at least some people take it, and they'll now live forever. And forget for a moment the sort of physical restrictions on this, the heat death of the universe. There's probably some way to imagine avoiding this inevitability. These people live forever. They're not going to die. Perhaps they're transported to some afterlife where they get to live forever in the New Jerusalem. Does ethics cease to exist Does it no longer matter how I treat my fellow creature because the prospect of life and death is no longer on the table? That seems highly implausible to me.
Yeah, so a couple things. First of all, believe it or not, Ayn Rand uses the very example you're bringing up in her essay, The Objectivist Ethics. She says, suppose there's an immortal robot.
But the robot makes it...
Yeah, I guess it's not identical. So people still can die.
Yep.
Okay.
No, sorry. People can't die, but they're still people. This is the thing. Ayn Rand's robot is this sort of non-volitional, sort of material thing that just sort of exists. And that thing doesn't have ethics. And I think that everybody would agree quite intuitively that if something is dead, this table, it can't have ethics. It, of course, doesn't follow that if something is not dead, it can. What I'm looking for is, well, I suppose evidence of that is actually a separate thing. I'm just granting for a moment that that's the case, that ethics does rely on life and the prospect of courses of action that will lead to your death, and saying, take Ayn Rand's immortal robot, but turn it into an immortal person who still has free will, even though you're right, I don't believe in it, but again, I'll just grant it for the sake of this, can still suffer, still cares, still has emotions. If we were suddenly immortal and I were causing somebody that you cared about to suffer in front of me, and you told me to stop, I'd say, well, your moral import is gone because none of us can die anymore, so the suffering that they're experiencing can't be called immoral.
Yeah.
It might emotively matter to you, but then, of course, if you wanted to start using that as any kind of moral prescription, you'd be jumping over to my side of the fence. So, where does this ethical force that I think most people in this room probably intuitively would still feel in that immortal situation come from?
Yeah, good question. Anytime there is a constructed experiment like this that is outside the realm of possibility as we know it, right? So the ring of Gyges, sometimes people bring it up. What if you had the ring of Gyges? Wouldn't you go around and rape and kill people then? And I always say, well, look, what's the purpose of this mind experiment when we're trying to figure out ethics for where we are here in this world living the way that we are? So the first thing I would say to this request is that not a lot hangs on it, if anything hangs on it, because no matter how I answer it, we still are not immortal, and we have to figure out how to live as human beings. Ethics is a practical subject. It's something that we need because we have to make life and death decisions, and decisions that are going to help us or harm us in life, how to set up relationships, businesses, societies, and all of that. So when we go to a wonderland of sorts and say, well, suppose that's not the case, but this other thing is the case, what would you do then? We're now really not dealing with ethics anymore. We're simply dealing with a different situation. Now, that said, I'll answer the question this way. If human beings could both be immortal, there's no way they could die, and yet they still have feelings and desires and can experience pain and joy, I think that ethics would still exist. It would just exist in a very different way than it does now. The right and wrong would not be about keeping you alive. It would be about making life simply the very best it could be, which, by the way, ethics is about now, too, because living...
Okay. So... I was very put off when he kind of brushed off the hypothetical, because I've watched tons of ethics debates, including like debates with you. I've seen you debate Eric Sampson. I've seen you debate a couple of people, and I've never watched an ethics debate I can think of that doesn't use some form of hypothetical that may sound outrageous, but has a point into challenging the person's position. What did you think about that?
Well, I would have been pretty put off if he didn't end up answering anyway, but he did. And respect for that. He did say he raises objections. It seems like he has issues with unrealistic thought experiments. I think I saw a video from him after the fact where he talked about this again, and I don't think I share his view about thought experiments. I don't know if I hesitate to say something too critical or too harsh, but I'll just say it. I feel like my impression is that he may not understand the purpose of thought experiments, like those kinds of thought experiments that are unrealistic. Right. Typically, the lack of realism in those thought experiments is intentional. And the reason it's intentional, there's a reason they're called thought experiments. There's different perspectives on what a thought experiment is.
But one of the ways of framing a thought experiment is to liken it to an actual experiment. So in an actual experiment, if you were testing a new medication on people, like, let's say it's a painkiller, you might tell them, hey, don't take other painkillers while you're participating in this experiment. Why? Because if they take the other painkillers and then they take your painkiller, it would be extremely difficult to tease apart the causal impact that your medication is having on them rather than the other. I mean, it's the whole point of an experiment is to determine, like, you set aside as many variables as possible. You say, I'm going to change this one variable and see if I observe a difference, so that you can then know whether that variable is causing the difference. Thought experiments in many cases function the same way. The reason you make them unrealistic is because the real world has lots of variables. There's lots of factors in play. And so you might have to craft an intentionally unrealistic scenario in order to hold all of those variables constant, to set them aside. Just like in a scientific experiment, you might have to create a very artificial circumstance to bring about your observed state of affairs. Like when you do a psychological study in a lab, it may not be realistic. When you say to a person, hey, don't take the other painkillers, only take this painkiller, that's not the real world. In the real world, you could take 4 painkillers at the same time. Ill-advised, but sometimes, depending on the type of symptoms you have, you might take a decongestant and a painkiller and some vitamins and drink a bunch of water. If you have all of those variables are super different for all of the participants in your study, you can't tell whether your painkiller is working because maybe it's one of those other variables, or maybe there's an interaction between variables. It's the same thing with thought experiments. You hold everything else constant. That's why they can get weird. So I do object when people are sort of object to unrealistic thought experiments. They're unrealistic by design. That's a feature. It's not a bug. It's a good thing when they're like that. Now, when a person does that as an excuse for, I shouldn't say excuse, because they may sincerely believe what they're saying. When they use that as a reason to not engage with the thought experiment, to not answer it, that will bug me. But he actually does answer it anyway. And I didn't find his answer unreasonable. Yes, ethics would still exist. It'd be really weird if he said it wouldn't, but it would be very different. I find that really plausible. So I actually agree with the answer he ends up giving. So how upset can I really be? He raises some objections, but then he plays ball anyway. So I think that's cool. So, but you said you had some objections. Was it just to the first part? Do we disagree here?
No, I mean, I definitely think morals would still exist. Ethics would still exist, right? It may be a different playing ground, but they would still exist so long as there are minds and there's a possibility of a moral or immoral act. But I think that I just don't like, because I've been in discussions. I'm sure I spend time on TikTok. That's where you and I guess, started talking, and you had to have come across the crowd now that doesn't like philosophy. In fact, there's a whole slur that's been invented for us. Do you know that slur? Have you been called it
Are
yet?
you talking about debate bros or something else?
Phil Bros.
Oh, Phil
yeah,
bros. Okay.
yeah, debate bros and Phil Bro. In fact, actually, that's perfect timing. Because of such abuse that I've received online, on TikTok in particular, I made this shirt.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, it doesn't work as a sneer term or an insult if you just embrace it.
Right. No, because
Cool.
I'm so shocked at the anti-intellectual culture in a debate community. I mean, TikTok to me is the best platform for debating people you don't know. It's the best platform. You put up a background that says whatever and welcome debaters. And then when I try to go up to, whatever, if it's like atheist or against God, or someone who has a philosophical position I disagree with or agree with, it's wild, the anti-intellectualism. And so this reminded me of that. I was like, wow, really? That's I like the first thing I think of for like a moral thought experiment would be the Zorpians, or the Zorians. That's the go-to. So, anyways, that irritated me. His disdain, I guess, irritated, and I was happy, like you said, he did end up answering it. But when I first saw that, I was kind of shocked. So, anyways, and by the way, if you find a point that they say that you want to just address right then, just tell me and we'll stop it real quick.
Okay, no
Because
worries.
Some of these
I'll do
are a little bit longer just so they can get the point across.
Well, I'm trying to not do that on purpose because when I review videos, I'll get 5 words in and I'll pause it and I'll talk for 30 minutes. So I'm trying to develop better review habits.
No, I got it. I mean, if it's just something you have to share, though, let me know because that might come
Right.
up.
Yeah.
All right. So next time, so let's move up. Once my mouse moves, get past the ring of ghosts in the imaginary worlds. Okay.
It's very easy to say, well, my survival prospects are actually much increased by living in a society where we treat each other nicely, where we have a social safety net, this kind of stuff. Fine. But if somebody tortures a dog, burns them alive on a fire or something because of the pleasure that they receive from doing so, I can't see any way for an objectivist to say that what they're doing is wrong. It in no way upsets their own survival. It in no way makes them closer to death. In fact, the sort of hedonistic release that they get from it may indeed bolster their life and make it more worth living and possibly even go on for longer for that reason. So how does your worldview capture the intuitive immorality of something like animal abuse?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think it's an intuitive issue. I think it's just a matter of fact that it is profoundly immoral to torture an animal for no good reason. So, I mean, I'm not against eating animals. I am against unnecessarily putting any animal through pain.
Sure.
And the reason is for the same reason that I hold life as the standard of value for human beings. Life as the standard of value is broader than just for human beings. Life is the standard of value for a flower, let alone a dog. I think it's wrong to just kick a beautiful flower. Now, I don't think it's immoral on the order that if you do that, you should be, or certainly it shouldn't be illegal to do that. But I don't think it's even immoral on the grounds that if you see somebody do that, you would hold them in contempt for the rest of your life. If I saw somebody torturing a dog, I would hold the person in contempt for the rest of my life. But let's stick with the flower because I want to take this to an extreme.
Yep.
A flower is beautiful; it's alive. What would be nihilistic to kick a flower dead just for the hell of kicking a flower dead? It's like hatred of the good for being good. It's hatred of life for being alive. So
blaspheming the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. And so there's a real richness and depth to this idea that life is the standard of value because it is broader than just human life as the standard of moral value. It means that that life is profoundly unique and important because it is the thing to which values pertain. It's the only thing to which values pertain.
And that sounds very attractive, but for your ideas here or your worldview to be objective, you'd need to say that to the nihilist who says, I just don't care. I just want to pick that flower. I honestly, I just don't recognize what you're talking about. You have to tell them that they are wrong, and presumably in a way that you could describe to them. So a moment ago when we were talking about life and death being intrinsic to ethics, there's an important distinction to make. There can be the life and death of the person doing the action, or the life and the death of the thing that's being acted upon. So it seemed like a moment ago you were saying that my ability to live and die is a requirement for my ability to be moral in my interactions with other people. But if a flower, though it can live and die, is not a moral agent. A flower is not the kind of thing that can have a moral course of action. Maybe that's because it doesn't have free will. Maybe also that's because it doesn't have emotions. Right? I'm saying both of these can be explained on our worldviews equally. But when you say that it's wrong for me to kick that flower, if I'm going to be a rational egoist, which means that for me personally, my life is what matters, my survival prospects, me alone, and even other human beings, their survival prospects only matter insofar.
May I just correct one thing there? Because I don't want you to go on with a mistake.
I want to make sure I'm getting you right.
So egoism does not hold that your life and your life alone matters. It means that your life is your primary concern. Human life consists of all sorts of relationships that are extremely important to you.
Yeah, but so they're important to you.
Yes.
So that their value
so
again is...
Yeah, but they are important.
They're important, but they're only important insofar as they serve me.
They're important to you. There's direct importance, and then there's all sorts of indirect importance. So, for instance, there are people in China right now or in India right now who I don't know, and you don't know. We don't know anything about what they're doing. But if they come to my mind, as they just have, because I've brought them up, do I wish them well? Yes, because they might be the person who invents the next thing that's just awesome for human life, right? So,
well, I wish them well, even if they were not.
Okay, either way, but the point is the potential in human beings is a valuable thing in and of itself.
I'm less attracted to that than I am about the whole kicking flowers thing, because I like to think that somebody who I've never met in China is doing well, regardless of their contributions. Indeed, even if they take more than they give throughout their life, maybe through no fault of their own. Maybe they're disabled, and so they rely on state benefits and don't have a very high-paying job, and so spend a lot of taxpayers' money for themselves and don't give very much in return. I'd still wish them well.
Oh, I certainly would too.
And not just as a product of, well, if I do that on the whole, if I practically adopt this life philosophy, it will be better for me. Although maybe I mean, I would say that I'm essentially doing that in an emotional level, because when I think of that person, it makes me upset, and that's why I care about them. So it's not a criticism, by the way, for me to say that this is, all about me, because the emotivist has to say that too. But the problem is that if even other human beings only matter insofar as they benefit me, then I can kind of see how that might be the case. I mean, you say you care about that man in China because he might invent the next big medicine, but a dog is not going to do that. But a flower is certainly not going to do that.
You're still, I think, and I've been unclear, so my apology. I'm not saying that human beings matter only insofar as they matter to you. Mm-hmm. For the same reason that a flower matters enough that to kick it over needlessly, I mean, it's one thing to clip a flower, to put it in a vase for your dinner, to have a bouquet on the table. But if you're just kicking it over nihilistically, you could say, well, the flower doesn't matter to me, so I kicked it over. Mm-hmm. But the problem with that is you're treating a living thing with contempt.
But what's the problem with doing that?
The problem with doing that is that life is the very thing that gives rise to the business of valuing and of conceptual terms that we use for beauty. I mean, beauty, anything like that. I'm not saying it matters to you in the same way or to the same degree as other things. I'm saying it's nihilistic. It's treating life as if it's of no value. And if I were to say, well, I don't care about other people because I don't know them at all. Now, there's no reason for me to have them in my mind. I can't keep 8 billion people in my mind.
Yeah.
Okay, so at that part, you just kind of continue the back and forth for a little bit, kind of doing it because Alex is pressing him and saying, well, wait a minute now. Is it your self-interest or is it life? Because there's kind of a conflation there for this is what's intrinsically valuable. Like, did you get that at all? That there was kind of like not a contradiction, but like a change in tune.
Yeah, the examples he gives were initially, at the very least, all about how, like when he gives examples of like why he wishes people in China and India well, it's because of the goods they could provide in a way that could benefit him. But he also doesn't seem to want to say that the only reason he cares about them is because they either do or have the potential to provide some good to him. That would be one perspective where things are good insofar as they have some real or potential to benefit you. It doesn't seem like he wants to say that. It seems like he wants to say that things could be good even if they wouldn't benefit you. I'm not sure whether that actually reflects a Randian perspective. So, at the very least, insofar as Atlas Shrugged like reflects Rand's views, the characterization of people that are unable to or unwilling to contribute to society doesn't seem like a very positive one. And maybe there's an important distinction there. Maybe he would make a distinction between a person that doesn't contribute much to society because of like an accident or because of their circumstances, even though they're doing their best and they're trying their hardest. That's different from, a quote unquote moocher, or like somebody that is just sort of leeching off of society. Maybe he would make a distinction and say, I wish the first person well, I wish the second person would get their life in order, because I don't wish them well in their present form. I don't know what he would say about that circumstance. The thing that drew my attention, though, is that in rapid succession, he says he doesn't think it's morally wrong to eat animals, but he does think it would be wrong to hurt them, like to cause them unnecessary suffering. But doesn't eating animals cause them unnecessary suffering? It's not necessary for us to eat animals.
Right.
I'm not a vegan, and I don't go around defending the vegan position, but I mean, come on. It's not necessary to eat animals. It's not necessary. People eat animals because they want to. And I think we all know that. And I do think that's a little strange for the normative moral position he's defending here. He doesn't even think you should stomp on a flower out of nihilistic glee or something. And you know, if that's the case, but it's okay to raise animals for the sole purpose of eating them, I don't see how he would square that on his normative view.
Oh, and what's funny is Alex actually used to be an ethical vegan. I don't think he isn't anymore. And it's funny because the community was really mad when he stepped away from that. But that was, if he was, he would have went right in, I know, on that issue, because that used to be a thing. Ultimately, I remember when I was having a debate / discussion with Amdir, our mutual friend, about realism. I pressed him on that. I said, well, if that's one of the values that you have to hold, then you would have to be a vegan. He said, I am. I'm an ethical vegan. Oh, okay, well, you're consistent with your position. But that's, I 100% agree. I think that's actually a gaping hole. It almost seems like Biddle might not realize he might be an anti-realist. He might not realize it, though.
Oh, you're saying about the anti-realism thing. I do want to say earlier, because I was taking a couple notes on it, he said something about how Rand emphasizes that, like, the question of value is value to whom and for what. And that immediately made me think, that sounds like stance dependent, sounds like anti-realism.
Right.
So yeah, you might be right. It might be that if we dug into a Randian perspective, there are at least anti-realist elements to it. I know that's a little different than what's covered in this recent clip, but yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I did specifically write that down and then I didn't address it.
Well, there's, and I need to look more into Rand's, I guess, work or position. A lot of times there's this traditional appeal I've seen that realists take. Like it's more like, well, this seems more traditional. Have you ever heard that before? That people say, like, that seems like a more traditional, I don't want to conservative, but like historical approach to ethics. Have you ever heard that?
In what context? Traditional or
Just
historical?
realism, just like stance independent. Usually it's going to be from a theistic point of view. Like if you go back to like Thomas Aquinas or something like that.
No, I'm not real familiar with that. So the type of moral realism I'm most familiar with is actually very secular and recent in its origins. It mostly emerged in the early 1900s.
I think the actual term did. Well, you would know that. But I think a lot of people in this guy's space, he seems to be in that there's like this realm of philosophers that specifically target more, kind of like more political. They focus a lot on things like postmodernism and stuff like that. That seems to be, a lot of them have this drive to want to move away to as a realist or a non-relativist, what some of them will say, because they want to avoid postmodernism. And that's the vibe that this guy gives me. Have you ever heard any of those people like Stephen Hicks or somebody like that?
I have a vague familiarity with that. There does seem to be this tendency to associate moral relativism in particular with origins in a kind of like universities and anthropology, and when people like post World War II stuff, where the sort of a recession of colonial influences around the world, there's this greater awareness that there's different cultures and different practices and different perspectives, and insofar as people developed this view about not just morality but everything is seen through the lens of social construction, and there's all these structures, and you get all these movements within academia predominantly. I have seen people react very negatively to that, and there does seem to be a political angle, a value angle, and sometimes a religious angle to it. But that stuff is largely partitioned off from the philosophical dispute. So in like analytic meta ethics, there aren't that many players in the game, and I don't know if I've ever heard postmodernism come up or undergo serious discussion there. There's basically nobody would call themselves a postmodernist or think in those terms that's working within the contemporary analytic tradition. So that's off in its own space of discourse. It's just not part of what I tend to engage with. Doesn't mean I wouldn't engage with it. It's just, that's another sort of
That's another game people are playing, I guess I could say.
Right. Sadly, that seems to get the majority of the position of the attention too online. You look up somebody like him, they'll have tons of views on their lectures, and just in standard meta ethics, they just it's sad like, that faith is in politics or involved, you're going to have more people to get interested in that. Um, let's see here, but yeah, that's just the vibe that Biddle gives me. Um, let's go on to the next part. But that's one of the big parts of him defending egoism. And then let's go into this next part here.
Right.
No,
if
no,
that's
no.
the case, then
Yeah. So I hold that it is both the choice to remain in existence, to remain living, is both in a technical sense pre-moral and even pre-rational. And the reason that it's pre-moral is because you don't need values until you've made the choice.
Okay.
And the reason it's pre-rational is because reason only has use value.
sure. And
Reason, you don't need reason or reasons or knowledge or truth or anything unless you choose to live. So the choice to live is just fundamental in that sense.
if finding the basis of ethics is starting with our moral claims that we make, it's wrong to murder, and saying, well, why? Well, we shouldn't murder because we shouldn't treat life with malice. Well, why? Because we should, and you sort of keep asking why, and then you eventually get something like, because you should remain alive. That
No.
should is either going to be objective or it's not, and if it's not, then the entire edifice that you've built upon it.
No, it's not
going to be
that
subjective
you
as well.
should remain alive. So if I take Frederick Douglass
Or
and
that I
put
should
him
remain
in a
alive.
cage and treat him like a subhuman animal and then put him out in the fields and make him do my work and then put him back in a cage at night, so just Mach 1 slavery. What is wrong with this? Why is slavery wrong? Well, because he is a human being, and a human life consists precisely in acting on his judgment and pursuing his values.
Mm-hmm.
So it's wrong for me to do that to him because he's a human being.
Why does that matter to you?
Pardon?
Why does it matter to you?
It matters to me because when we're talking about moral principles, we're talking about principles, and principles are things that apply to all of the units in the classification we're talking about. We're talking about human beings, and human beings have a certain nature. I, of course, want to live my life and have a beautiful life, but I don't own her life or his life or your life. Your life belongs to you. So this is where just as the requirements of life give rise to the principles of morality, one of the principles of morality that gives rise to a proper political system is the moral principle of individual rights.
I don't see what the principle is here, because a moment ago I thought that we were talking about rational egoism, that for me, the thing that matters is my survival and flourishing.
Yeah.
And now it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're suggesting that somehow my recognition that, I desire my own flourishing in life is somehow indicative that every person has this intrinsic value amongst them that I should respect, even if it wasn't of benefit to me.
So I don't think every person has intrinsic value. Every person has value insofar as he or she chooses to live and is respecting the rights of others to do the same. So if a jihadist comes after Ayan Hirsi Ali and tries to kill her, and I'm there and I shoot him dead, I did not destroy a value. This guy had no value at all. He turned himself into a subhuman, sub-animal creature who had no value at all.
But suppose he...
My point here is simply that human life is not intrinsically valuable. It's valuable if you choose to live and if you stick with the program of living as a human being as against living as a not human being.
I think we might be getting confused between what I said earlier about the prospect of living and dying in the person committing the moral act and the person upon whom the act is being committed. So suppose a not suicide murderer, just a murderer, decides to kill somebody, and they say, well, I value my own life, I value my own flourishing, and maybe they... And suppose, it were actually the case that given the intricacies of their life, it would be better for their life, it would be better for their flourishing if this innocent person were to be killed. And they go and do so.
I can't buy that because you can't sketch a realistic scenario in which that would be the case.
You can't think of a scenario in which the death of an innocent person would benefit you?
No.
Even hypothetically?
Not off the top of my head. Can you give me one?
So, for example, you're an unempathetic creature who genuinely just doesn't care for the well-being of others, and if that person, if
Well,
that
now
is,
you're going to a broken person.
Well,
you're
but
you're
by
giving
what
me a
standard?
well, okay, but morality applies to the factual requirements of human beings given the kind of animals that we are under normal circumstances. If you tell me, well, what about a psychopath who doesn't care about anybody? How are you going to get him to accept your moral code? I'm not going to get him to accept my moral code. He can't understand why or wouldn't even care to understand
but is
why.
he acting unethically?
He's acting unethically from my perspective, even though he can't understand it.
But is he acting
given that-
unethically? Because from my standard, sounds awfully subjective. Is he acting immorally, objectively?
He's acting objectively immorally given the factual requirements of human life, which he apparently cannot understand because he is a broken human
But
being.
if it's a factual requirement of human life, then he can't be a human life without that thing. It can't be a factual requirement of human life, because here's a human life that doesn't have that.
So yeah, when we're talking about a class of anything, we're talking about the general characteristics of that class. Now, there are always outliers, and in the case of human beings, there are outliers, borderline cases, where take Terry Schiavo, who in Florida, 15, 20 years ago, was essentially brain dead, and she was in the hospital. You know the case.
Yeah.
And so the question was, some of her family wanted to pull the plug and let her die, and others were saying, no, we want to keep her alive because God or something. And she was clearly, her brain was just sauce. She was not a living being. So did Terry Schiavo have rights? Did she have a right to live at that point? Well, no, she wasn't even there anymore. There was no there. And in the case of the kind of person you're talking about, a psychopath who, if you let him out, is going to run around and try to kill people or something, this is a subhuman creature to whom morality does not apply anymore because he's so broken.
All right. So a bit to unpack there. So what are your thoughts, Lance?
Oh, there's a lot going on there. I do like the way Alex is pressing him. One thing I've noticed, because I was familiar with Alex back when he was Cosmic Skeptic, and I think look, I have my misgivings. I would have criticisms of him. There's lots of critical things I could say. I usually say too many critical things, so I'll say some positive things. I like the way he's pressing him here because he's holding his feet to the fire in a way that's polite. He's not pushing him too far. He's not mocking him. He's not trying to do a gotcha where he can't get out of it. He's just pressing him, like with just enough pressure to not go too hard or too soft. I really like the phrase he used. I don't think I would ever say this. He said something like, "I think we're getting confused here," where I would be inclined to say, "I think you're getting confused here," because I wouldn't think I'm the confused one, but by bringing himself into it, like we're getting confused here. You know what it sounds like? It sounds like something Sam Harris would say. It sounds like a kind of a rhetorical olive branch you give somebody to say, look, hey, I think you're confused, but I'm going to be polite and include myself anyway. I think Alex is doing an excessive politeness in that respect. So I think he might be leaning a little bit too much into being polite. So just as a meta commentary, I like that he presses people. I would prefer he press them a little harder. Sometimes, what I especially notice, he did this with I think William Lane Craig too, and what's his name, Peter Hitchens. There's kind of like a punchline or a point that Alex is trying to get across, but he doesn't explicitly say it. He leaves it to the audience to like get what he's getting at. Here, you're not hearing Alex say there appears to be a straightforward inconsistency between your purported adherence to egoism and your apparent discomfort in saying that people have value that doesn't seem to comport with egoism. But he's not coming out and saying that. He's just implying it. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, he's definitely, Alex has really blossomed into a TV personality to a certain extent. Like he regularly goes on talk shows throughout Europe and particularly
Piers Morgan.
Right. And then he does like the Premiere Unbelievable show all the time. And he's also been debating people that are very experienced in their field since he was a kid. So, I mean, he just he seems a lot more experienced. It seems like he really has the upper hand here, and he's had these same objections before. He knew what he was going to ask, and I don't think that Craig Biddle has really had. It seems like he hasn't really been too much in a back and forth with somebody who adamantly disagrees with him. Maybe with like a colleague who would predict objections, but these seem like pretty standard objections that you would be ready to handle. And he just seems to be kind of tripping over himself.
Yeah. I don't know how it is that Alex has consistently been able to do this in debates. Like what I have to say is like, I think there's what I would consider room for improvement, ways for him to refine his approach to things. In particular, where I think Alex is strong is when he's pressing other people. And in terms of his way of socially navigating these discussions, I thought Peter Hitchens flipping out was just embarrassing and totally out of line because he just wasn't pressing him that hard.
Right.
And so when I see people tripping all over themselves for, like you point out, Alex is not giving people wildly sophisticated and bizarre, like he's not throwing curveballs at people. He's throwing straight pitches and people are just swinging and missing. And so I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that there's something about his way of presenting himself that is disarming. It reminds me of Louis Theroux. Do you know him? Like he used to do those documentaries.
Doesn't ring.
Like it was like Strange Weekends or something. He just had a way of talking to people that would get them to divulge information that I never could. I think I tend to be like, just to compare myself, in a lot of ways too blunt to navigate conversations. Like I might have said, I think he's confused at that point, and that might make him defensive and close up a bit in a way that so Alex gets people to open up, and that makes them more vulnerable. In other words, maybe I shouldn't be saying this because I want him to keep doing this, and I don't want the people he's doing this to realize what he's doing and then put up mental barriers. So should I shut up? I don't know.
No.
I think it's obvious enough what he's doing. Also, I think when you're in those situations, it's hard to avoid this. I think it would work on me, for instance. I think he could get me tripped up maybe. And I would find that deeply frustrating. Because if he's not throwing curveballs that I'm tripping up over just because he's so polite, that would bother me. I'd be annoyed afterwards. So yeah, that's definitely going on here. As far as the content, I'm a little puzzled because I think Alex did make a point. He threw in a point there where it's like, there's a few things, but one of them was the way in which Biddle is framing his position. It at times, once again, it does kind of sound subjectivism-ish. It did again at the beginning here. But I also think in terms of the normative ethics, there's a few things there where I have real concerns. Like I'm not sure. I'm not terribly fond of him calling people subhuman. I don't know what that means. Like, does he mean they're literally not a human, or does he mean like people can say subhuman to mean they're so awful I don't even want them to be in the same room as me. But that's very different from saying their psychological constitution is such that I literally consider them not to be a member of my species. Those are very different things. If he means that literally, that's really weird because it's just not true. If he means that non-literally, then I don't think that's the best choice of words, because in a philosophical discussion where part of what's at stake is precisely what your position is, precision and clarity is critical. So I would not use that term there if I didn't mean it literally, and I really hope he doesn't mean that literally. As far as it being a normative term, I think it goes too strong here. But I'm also just very unsatisfied with it because he gives this description where he's like, okay, well, are they acting objectively immoral? And his characterization of that seems a little strange. He talks about like what you would need to do. Like, it's not because, I think Alex makes a good point where he's like, well, this person is literally not able to do what you think seems to be a factual requirement for like being a human. And then his characters, but like they're a person. They appear to be. I don't know if Alex is human specifically, but psychopaths are humans. They're people, I would say. And if your definition excludes them on stipulative grounds, I think the problem is your definition, because they're clearly humans. So that's weird. Membership in being a human is not a moral category. Evil people or people that have problems with empathy are not people. They're still people.
So that's strange. Now, what's strange about it is he's like, well, this is like, it's, what did he say exactly? Like the average or general, what people generally like, something like that, right?
Yeah, like the norm or the stand. Yeah.
So there's an issue with this from a biological perspective. I mean, there'd be questions I would have, like, what proportion of people, like, what if the population was 7% psychopaths? Would that be enough where we would say it's normal, or that's like that is included? What about 30%? Because
how do we
there's individual differences, huh?
How do we determine that either way? Like, where does that? Why is there a bar? Like, in what determines that bar?
I don't know what the bar would be, but here's the thing to point out from a biological perspective. Not all organisms exhibit like the same. There's not like a organismic nature where all members of a species exhibit the same characteristics. You can actually have species where there's multiple types or expressions of phenotypes within a given population that are it's in an evolutionarily stable equilibrium where both types of groups are like both phenotypic groups. Sorry, I don't want to use too much technical terms. I'm also not even a specialist in evolutionary biology, so I shouldn't be doing that anyway. So basically, you have a species, right? Humans. It could be that natural selection selected for people to generally be empathic and cooperative and to care about others. But what can happen in a given species is that it could be there's a selective advantage if you exploit that and you enter into the species as a psychopath, like as an exploiter that doesn't have empathy and can take advantage of other people. And it could be, you can imagine, so imagine people that are cooperative or are exploiters, right? If you have all exploiters, that might be bad for individuals, because if everybody is untrustworthy, you don't have a lot of targets to exploit. So it's not from a selective point of view, individuals are not favored if they exploit. If you're all cooperative, though, and that seems advantageous, then for one person to enter and exploit, it's advantageous. And you can imagine a population of 100 cooperators, and it could be beneficial if you're the one exploiter. You have a huge number, a huge benefit, a huge selective advantage. If there's two, there might still be enough people to exploit for you to get a benefit, but it might cap out at, say, 10 out of 100. And if there's 11 exploiters, it's no longer beneficial. And so what you could get is a stable equilibrium where 90% of the population, natural selection basically favors within this species, 90% being cooperators, 10% being exploiters. And it actually maintains that over a period of time where both groups are expressed in the population. And they don't have to be 50-50. It could be that there's, given whatever the trait is, some proportion of each where it's beneficial. So the point here is just that from a biological perspective, it can entirely be the case that there are selective advantages for a subset of the population being psychopaths or exhibiting some other, you could say, non-standard or atypical or non-modal characteristic. And it's actually favored biologically. Like evolution is going to keep that in the population. So if he's going to say it's like what's typical, does that mean like more than 50%, more than 80%? That doesn't really, like, it could be, in other words, a short way to put this is it may actually be typical of humans for there to be a few psychopaths around. Like that could actually be what is characteristic of our species. And if that's the case, then there isn't a single template for what humans are like. It could be most humans are like this, some humans are like that. I don't even know that you need to take an evolutionary framework to this. You could take a cultural perspective on this. You could take a variety of perspectives, where as long as you just question whether there is a single fixed shared human nature, as long as you think maybe there is more than one expression of what human beings are like, I think this generates a problem for his perspective.
No, definitely. I think because it seems like the same arbitrariness he was complaining about subjectivism falls in line here. Like, what you can't just say, well, if they have these behavior characteristics, like you said, that doesn't make them not human. What are they, humans? And then we have humans over here, and we get to dehumanize them based off of this criteria, which ultimately that criteria is going to be arbitrary. That's that's strange. Again, so I was saying, I think he may be an anti-realist and just doesn't realize it. That would be when part 2 comes out. We'll see if my prediction comes true. All right, now let's head into the last part, and then after that, we'll see if we have any questions, And then I know you have to get up early because you're working over at Cornell on the East. Well, I guess you were in the East Coast before and in Florida, but
Mhm.
I'm sure they want you there bright and early. Um, what time you got to be at work?
8 a.m. Pretty
Oh,
early.
okay, just like me. All right. All right, let's get to this last part where he kind of gives a summation of what he's trying to defend here.
Define right for you.
Also, I want to make sure we're conscious of time, because I want to make sure we've got time for Q&A, but I also want to make sure we exhaust
So
what we need to
started
exhaust.
at 4:15. We should start Q&A now. Let me define right so you understand what.
Take the. Whoa, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll let you have the last word here, and then we'll open it up.
And you can reply to this if you want before we start. But just so you understand, because I'm not using a term just sort of out of.
Sure.
I don't want this to be out of the blue.
Sure.
I regard a right as a moral principle that is this. It is all moral principles are recognitions. That's the in here part of a fact, something out there. And so in this case, what is it that we're recognizing when we talk about a right? We are recognizing a fact, and that fact is this. In order for a human being to live fully as a human being, he must be free to act on the very thing that makes him a human being, the judgment of his mind. Okay? In order for a human being to live fully as a human being, he must be free to act on the very thing that makes him a human being, the judgment of his mind. The psychopath is so broken that he will violate the fact that everyone else has this right if we let him act on the judgment of his mind, because his mind is so broken. So we have the right to say, let me finish.
Yeah.
We have the right to say, by nature of your problem, you cannot have the right to be free because you will destroy the rights of other people. And that is a perfectly legitimate way to conceptualize the situation of this kind of person. We do the same thing with criminals, even though they many times can understand these ideas. But if they have violated rights, we say, you forfeited your rights. In their case, it's because they could understand it, but they didn't. We put them in jail. Sometimes they get put to death. We could talk about whether that's justified or not. But certainly putting them in jail for life if they murder people is. So a right is simply the recognition of this fact, that human beings need freedom from force in order to live. And we enforce that. Why? Because the whole purpose of moral principles, and in my view of proper political principles, is to enable human beings to live as independent agents without being coerced or killed or raped or whatever by other people. So rights are really, really tied to egoism in the sense that their purpose is to enable individuals to pursue their values and flourish. And if somebody violates rights, you can't do that thing. So that's why we get to lock him up, regardless of what he understands.
I'm mostly interested in moving to Q&A. I would only say, I suppose I'd ask the audience to imagine, I don't know, sort of the sort of arbitrariness of saying that a person with a certain brain is broken and a person with a certain other kind of brain is not. If it's not just going to be based on majority, if it's going to be based on some principle about what a brain ought to be that is completely unrelated to how many people have different kinds of brains, then I want you to imagine everybody dying except for a single psychopath and a single non-psychopath. And the first person saying that their brain is broken, and the other person saying, no, my brain's just fine, it's yours that's broken. And see if you can find any kind of standard that would allow you to say that one of those people was correct according to anything other than what they thought a brain should do, subjectively.
Are you muted?
Sorry about that.
Yep.
But so what Alex said right at the end there, that's what we were just talking about. That's a problem. You boil it down to the two people, one who's a psychopath and one who's not. Now who's the non-human, who's the human, that you now have an issue. But what were your thoughts on his rights definition there?
I don't even know what to make of that view of rights. It all sounds obscure to me. I'm not really super familiar with it. I would just have to talk to him or hear more of what he has to say to get a sense of that. What I can say is, I thought this was supposed to be a discussion about meta ethics. That's a bunch of normative ethics.
I am really puzzled by stuff like he makes these claims like, well, stuff about what you got to do in order to be a human.
Yeah.
Is that a descriptive claim, a normative claim? What if the person just like, okay, well, I don't want to be a human. I want to go be a not human by doing this stuff that's because, okay, if someone says, look, humans, this is what human nature is. So if you want to be a human, you got to do what the human nature stuff is. Look, in practice, I'm probably going to want to do what the human nature stuff is. Like if human nature is stuff like maybe on his view, it might be stuff like, pursue your ambitions, self-actualize, be awesome. And, that might end up meaning that being a good family member, a good community member. It might be. I hope he holds a view like that. And I'm on board if that's human nature. But what would I say to someone that just says, yeah, I don't want to do that stuff. I don't like it. I don't care. I really gave it a lot of thought. Like, because my initial reaction would be they're confused. They don't realize that this would actually be good for them. Because someone could say, I don't want to have close connections with friends and family. I don't want to have a fulfilling career. I want to sit around and watch TV all day. I actually think that person's going to end up being miserable. But let's say you have the reflective couch potato, right? And the reflective couch potato is just like, look, I gave it a ton of thought, and I actually do want to just sit around and watch TV all day. I want everyone else to pay for me to do it. I'm not going to do anything like, the Randian worst nightmare. What mistakes is that person making? Like, and if you say, well, they're not even being human. What if they're like, cool, well, being human sucks. I want to be a couch potato. Again, like, would he say that they're factually mistaken about anything? Because I would just say that's unfortunate, like that. Like, but I wouldn't say that they're wrong about the facts. Like, I don't want people to live their lives that way. If they're actually unhappy. If they're super happy, that complicates things. But I like what? I don't understand where he's coming from. I don't get it.
Yeah. No,
maybe part of that's my problem, but it also just seems something that I noticed about all of these clips, and I had this impression from the first part of the video that I'd watched prior to us reviewing it, is it sounds like they just keep explaining their views and explaining their views and explaining their views. And up to a point, Alex is pressing him on what looks like an implied inconsistency. So there's some degree of arguing there. But for the most part, it looks like Biddle is largely on the defensive and is largely just trying to explain his view. And maybe that's a good thing. But I do want to see more. I want to see more of him like trying to critique. Like we didn't see a single critique of emotivism. And I would have liked to see that. Maybe there were some. But sometimes I see a debate and it looks like someone saying, here's what I think. Another person just goes, here's what I think. Here's what I think. Here's what I think. And I'm like, where's the clash? Okay.
Right. Well, there wasn't too much. I mean, there was some parts where he was challenging Alex, but Alex was able to swiftly answer.
Okay.
So, and it just kind of went right back on Biddle. That's why I was very shocked at just how Alex dominated him in this debate. Like, I don't think Biddle was prepared. I don't know how much time he's spent on a debate stage discussing ethics, but it seems to me whenever you're going to have a discussion, the old subjective versus objective, you have to establish a meta-ethical justification. And that doesn't happen a lot of the times, obviously, like here. It just went straight into normative. And then from there, it just then Alex can just continue to ask you questions about the ought, like to continue to ask you meta-ethical questions, and you haven't answered them. And so that's, and then even with normative ethical questions, I think, I don't think egoism works. That's a view I've learned and kind of tossed over here after watching this.
Yeah, I've never found egoism very appealing in the first place. I do want to make a point about like a meta debate point. So you could view, and I'm not recommending people do this, you could view this debate and other debates kind of like a boxing match. And you can imagine from your description, Alex got some questions and he like got around them really quickly. You could think of a boxing match where one person like quickly ducks out of the way, blocks a couple punches, and they keep putting the pressure on the other person. If you're watching a soccer game, the ball's just on one side all the time. The goalie keeps blocking shots in the goal, but it's just never on the other side. And those are instances where you might say that the person is dominating. That boxer's probably going to win in points. If it's constant in your side of the field, you're much more likely to get a goal scored on you than the other side. And in sports, that's dominating. But in a discussion, a person might just opt to take a passive role. And I've done this in discussions. Like someone could say, "Hey, I think your anti-realist view is wrong. Can I ask you a bunch of questions?" And if I just sit there taking all the hits and I'm not pushing back, I wouldn't say you should necessarily construe that as me losing the debate because I was under pressure the whole time. A person can just voluntarily be under pressure. People can put me under pressure, and I think it's like if someone like sometimes a boxer will stand there and take a couple punches. You could imagine a boxer goes into the ring, the other person starts hitting them, and they just stand there and they just take all the punches, and then at the end they're just like, "I feel fine." That I would say that person won that match. That's wild. And so I feel like I've come away from discussions where the other person has pressed me a lot, and I just handle it.
Right.
I feel like I did fine there. And you could say they scored all the points on me. So even if they landed a couple hits, I didn't land any on them. I think that's a weird way of looking at it because it's not about whether the person wins or loses, but how well the idea withstood a certain degree of pressure or scrutiny. And if an idea is under pressure the entire time and it does okay, maybe that's not so bad of a position. Now, I think I don't know how I don't have the impression he defended his position that strongly, but it could have been way worse. So I don't think he did too badly.
Okay. Yeah, I guess
I don't know what do you think?
I was a little I don't know this guy, so I didn't have any like presuppositions or expectations for him. I know Alex, and I know Alex is a very skilled debater. So I guess I was expecting Alex to do well. And I think his age may have fooled him as well a little bit. Oh, he's a young guy. I'll be able to kind of walk over him. I just, I also have higher expectations for a naturalist realist position. And I don't like to see the jump immediately from meta into normative when you spend like this much time with meta and that much time with normative. It just seems weird to me like that. Now the whole time you're just going to be you're going to hear where's the ought, where's the ought, where's the ought. Then you're it's going to be a challenge. So that would be my take on that. But
yeah, I do wonder why Alex didn't say, whoa, you're getting off topic. Let's bring it back to meta ethics. That's something a lot of people, Phil bros, or might say, hey, that's normative ethics. That's not what we're talking about. Stop changing the subject. A lot of people would just do that and say that's a different topic. We're not talking about that.
Alex, I think like you said, he was being polite. Like when he said we were getting confused here, I think he was just being polite. And so rather than challenging him, because this was an event hosted by Biddle and his organization, and I think it's a series of discussions that they were having for those students. And so I think Alex was just kind of, all right, well, you know what? I'm not sure that that's the route this guy really wants to take because a lot of people don't really get the distinction between meta and normative ethics. It took me a long time to get that distinction, especially as someone who has no formal education in philosophy. So this guy's a professor, so kind of, shame on you. But at the same time, maybe he just, some people don't, if they're, especially like that realm I was talking about earlier, the more political, popularized realm, yet still academics, they do that. They do that a lot. If you watch guys like Stephen Hicks, even somebody, what's his name? He talks about Marxism all the time. James Lindsay, like people like that. These people, they're kind of like in the political realm, and they talk about ethics, but they constantly spend this much time on meta, this much time on normative, and act like the meta wins. Well, my meta, and then when they get challenged, like here, it doesn't do so hot. So, yeah, that would be my view. Do we have any? We do have some questions here. One of them, this isn't necessarily related to Lance. So if you guys have any questions, put them in the chat. Just because I've heard people ask me this before. Thoughts on the tag argument? So do you know what the tag argument is, Lance? No, okay. It's a presup argument. It's a transcendental argument for God. I am not a presup apologist. I don't like presuppositional apologetics. I think it's really unfair to just say that, oh, well, you have no way to justify knowledge. You have no way to justify epistemology because there's no God. And like, that doesn't seem like a really intellectually honest way to debate. And there's a big growing scene of presuppositional apologists in the space, and it like completely pushes out learning good philosophy, and I think that that's a bad thing. I think that's a problem. I'm surprised you haven't seen that. You haven't been doing lives on TikTok, seeing those people? Or?
Not recently, but I don't tend to discuss. Like I've talked to presuppositionalists a couple times. I'll just say what I think. The few times I've talked to people, I've tended to find their presuppositionalists interpersonally insufferable. I just couldn't stand talking to them, and I just was like, okay, I'm not going to talk to people that defend this view. I'm not saying if you defend that view that you can't be super nice, but the specific people I talked to, it was impossible to talk to them. They didn't just have a view that I think is hard to engage with. They had this demanding sense that you follow their script and they're not going to go off script. And that's not how I do conversations.
Did you debate Darth Dawkins?
I did talk to Darth Dawkins briefly, and someone uploaded it to YouTube. There's about a 5-minute clip, and I just noped out of that conversation very quickly.
Oh, who posted that?
I don't know. It's not an interesting. It just sounds like, oh, this person is unfriendly and impossible to talk to. I'm out of here. So, some people find that to be a form of entertainment. I don't find that kind of conversational style productive. If other people do, they're welcome to have it, but I'm not gonna get involved in that.
No, he won't even let me go on and like talk to him, because I'll try to say, dude, is this the way we think that Christ would want us to talk to people? Like,
yeah, that's another thing. I tend not be. I don't understand a lot of the Christian apologists that are like smug or arrogant, or they're like, I mean, to put it in a cringy way, like very un-Christ-like. It doesn't even look like they're trying. And I find that puzzling, because if so much of what you're doing centers on trying to emulate a person that exhibits these qualities that everyone would recognize as pretty darn appealing, humble, compassionate, but firm, like, I don't see a lot of them acting like that. And it's weird. Like, why not try? Nope. I don't get it.
Yeah, that's classic not following the way of Christ. So it's really unfortunate. We do have a question here. This is actually from my brother, who co-hosts this channel with me. He has a question for you, Lance. What is your position on theism? I don't think we talked about your position on that earlier.
Yeah, it's not a very interesting one. So I'm an atheist. I believe there aren't any gods. I don't tend to discuss the topic much. I used to talk about it a lot more. It's becoming increasingly clear to me that I know so little about philosophy of religion that I couldn't really run in those circles unless I did a lot of reading that I simply don't have the time to read. So one of the things that has happened over the course of getting a PhD, going to grad school, doing all that, is you become ultra self-aware of what it's like from a first-person point of view to really understand a specific, very narrow topic very well. And that has just drawn in very stark relief how much I don't understand other topics. So I just don't have the knowledge to really engage in those in debates very well. I'm not very familiar with transcendental arguments. So yeah, I'm an atheist. If you ask me why, I think I would give you something that would be pretty shallow and unsatisfying. And that it might take quite a bit of discussion to unpack it, because what I don't have is a bunch of sort of canned responses. Like, I can't say, because of these reasons and not those reasons. It's more of something that would unfold in a discourse.
Okay. Gotcha. Let's see. That means we have to talk more, Lance. We have to talk.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
All right. So I have another question for you from my, let's see, Aten Sure? Aten Sure? I am really sorry if I botched that name. Do you have a view on scientific anti-realism?
There's a sense in which you could say technically I would be a scientific anti-realist. So I'm a pragmatist, and my view of, so I'm an empiricist first and foremost, and a pragmatist. So the sort of metaphilosophical foundation for me is empiricism and pragmatism. And what I end up seeing, like, if you ask me whether atoms are real and whether like planets are real and chemistry, are the chemicals real? Of course I'm going to say yes, like they are real. But the sense in which I think of things as real has so little by way of the sorts of metaphysical commitments that other people would ground their philosophical views in, that it doesn't really have the elements that I would be comfortable calling it like a scientific realist position. I think it would be a little too much to get into why I think that. But there's a certain sense in which at its foundation, a pragmatic view takes this very flexible, constantly moving, variable conception of truth, where truths have to do work within a particular system or model of the world. Those systems and models change over time. So the truths themselves change over time. It's not that we find out our old views were false and the new views are true. It's actually that truth itself can change over time. And that is in stark contrast to people that endorse like a correspondence theory of truth. They think that there's the truth of the capital T out there, and then our models are attempting to capture or approximate that truth. And maybe we asymptotically approach truth of the capital T, but we never get there. That's not my view. My view might functionally look a lot like that. And that might be a standard scientific realist empiricist view. My view would function that way in practice, but I have a different conception of truth. And as a result of that, a lot of the stuff that would fall into a sort of contemporary naturalist metaphysics, it goes out the window for me, and I don't endorse those views.
Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha. So no Aristotelian realism, huh?
No.
Gotcha. Okay. We might have covered this part earlier. I know we were just talking about more your view on metaphysics, not ethics. But what is your stance on normative ethics? So I know you're an
Oh, this is cool, like
anti-realist.
covering all the bases. Yeah, so metaphysics pragmatist, epistemology pragmatist, I guess. They sort of collapse into one another for me. And then as far as, meta ethics, already mentioned anti-realism, but I didn't say much about why I think that or whatever. I mean, maybe that's for another time. Normative ethics, I used to be a utilitarian. So I used to be a classical hedonic utilitarian, so like total act utilitarian. There's specific characteristics you would use to distinguish it from other types of utilitarianism. I now say, like, I'm not really serious when I say this, but I say I'm a retired utilitarian. What I mean by that is I didn't renounce utilitarianism in favor of another normative moral theory. I just sort of was a utilitarian, and then I just stopped thinking about or doing normative ethics. Worrisomely, that might support contentions that if you become a moral anti-realist, you'll stop caring about normative ethics. And that's a reason to worry about it. But I should say I was an anti-realist at or around the same time I was a utilitarian, which would have been in my late teens, 17, 18 or so. I have no memory of ever being a moral realist, and I have no memory of ever being a sort of pre-utilitarian. Is I think pretty much the moment I smelled those views, I was like, those are for me. So I was both for a very long time. And it's only more recently that normative ethics, I just sort of lost interest in it. And it's not just that I lost interest in it, like I don't care about it, but I do have a view. Kind of like a philosophy of religion. I have views, like I would say I'm an atheist, but I don't really think about it. Normative ethics, I actually lost a sense that it's like a legitimate line of inquiry. And part of the reason for that might be related to my meta-ethical views, but very roughly, I don't see why we would try to regiment or provide a set of principles behind our moral standards. I have values, preferences, views about what I want the world to be like, but they don't fit into some principled hierarchy that is internally coherent, logically consistent, and is grounded in a specific set of normative moral principles. I like what I like. I don't like what I don't like. It'd be a bit to me like trying to come up with like a theory behind like why I like the foods I like. Okay, I love chocolate. I don't like chocolate ice cream. Why? I don't know. I can't explain it. Is there do I have to give an argument for why? I don't think that makes any sense. And it's the same thing with my normative moral values. I don't think I need arguments for them. I don't have arguments for them. I'm not sure they're based on principles. And so I've taken a view that functions in practice a lot like a something, maybe like a particularism. Like I'm just like, yeah, I value these things. I don't value those things. And that's all there is to it. There's nothing further. And so you could say it's something like there's a no principle or like a no principles or no further fact view is my normative ethical stance. Basically, my normative ethical stance is there's no normative ethical theories or principles that I endorse at this point.
Gotcha. I mean, I respect that. I think that it's definitely, I think meta ethics is such a big challenge. And you take that, right on the horns. And that's like, if you have a solid ground for your meta ethics normative ethics can kind of ebb and flow. Because my goodness, I've changed my normative view like 5 times. That's why I say my current views under construction. I probably lean towards, I really like virtue ethics. I think that that goes well. I like Aristotle's virtue ethics, and I think it works well with Christianity. But then somebody will say something that is better than that in a week from now, and I'll just, oh, maybe that's so. Whereas meta ethics, my mind's not going to change that often, and there's just, it's a different ball game. So I respect that. I think that's pretty cool of you. How many more questions do you think you have time for? Because I know it's
I can handle a few more. I
okay.
could kind of let you know if I've had enough.
Okay, cool. All right, so Vicky has a question. Let's see, and this is somewhat related to normative. Thoughts on Kantian ethics? Do categorical imperatives work?
I can answer the second question first. No, they don't work. I'm not a huge fan of the categorical imperative or Kant's ethics in general. I hesitate to put it in quite these terms, but I think that they barely make sense. I don't know why one would engage in this like, why does it have to be universalizable? And often the way in which one universalizes things, that, well, if everyone stole, then there wouldn't be any like, I don't even think that that's true. Everyone could be thief and there's still private property. So a lot of times, like the alleged contradictions that arise, to me, they sound very dubious. And so the way in which people go about trying to create these imperatives strike me as post hoc rationalizations for moral views they want to endorse in the first place. And then they engage in this procedure after the fact, and it just strikes me as super implausible, and I don't buy it. It's unclear what's motivating it, why I would care, whether something can be universalized or not, or, there's a few other formulations. None of them strike me as particularly compelling. You can't use people as a means to ends. Why not? I'm not saying I favor using people as a means to an end, but I just don't think Kant gives us good reasons to favor any particular moral standard over another. I've never found it remotely compelling. And I honestly am puzzled as to why it's even popular, because it just strikes me as a very weird way of going about trying to, like Kant is the sort of a exemplar of deontology, and his particular deontological approach just strikes me as honestly just weird. Like, I don't even know how someone would bend their mind into pretzels to come up with something that bizarre. And there's probably just better representations of deontological perspectives. Just a brute appeal to rights. Like, it just seems like people have these rights and not those other rights. That strikes me as a more viable, like, you just can't do these certain things. So putting hard limits on what people could do, where you're saying, look, it's not about consequences. You can't just torture people, even if it would bring about good consequences. You don't need to put that in a particular, like, you don't need to put that in a Kantian framework. That doesn't have to be a categorical imperative, or like pass through the procedures, the constructivist procedures he comes up with. You could just say, yeah, that torturing bad. And like, that strikes me as a better deontological view. Torture bad. What more do you need to say? I don't get the appeal of Kant's ethics.
I think I've had more of the naturalists, or I'll say atheists, that I've talked to that are realists. A lot of them ascribe to deontology, and then a lot of anti-realists will ascribe to threshold deontology.
Mm-hmm.
And I just never got the attractiveness of Kant. That just never seemed interesting to. It never seemed like something I actually considered to be something I would defend, or something that I would hold over other views. So I share your view there. So another question we have is, I think this is actually pertaining to your first question. This is Eaton again. It's when you first were asked about what your normative views were, and he asks, is that a version of moral particularism? But it's
it might sound like it in practice, but I don't really think that it is. I'd probably call myself something like a normative quietist. I just don't. And what I mean by that is that I think that the central questions motivating normative ethics are misguided and pointless questions that don't have real answers. And I just don't think there's a line of inquiry to pursue there. So we should just stop doing it. Which maybe that's like a really bizarre position, but I'm like, yeah, I just don't think normative ethics is a thing. That's why I compared it to something like Like imagine you try to do normative gastronomy and you're trying to come up with like the principled considerations that underlie why some food is good and other food is bad. It just seems ridiculous and like a total waste of time to me. And what I don't mean by that is like a psychological account of like what causes me to like umami and salty things or whatever. That's because normative ethics isn't moral psychology. It's a different thing. So normative gastronomy would be something like what principles underlie why like chocolatey things are good and other like it's just what a waste of time that would be. It would be really weird. And I just came to feel the same way about morality. So yeah, so I like what I like and I don't like what I don't like. But I don't try to say but that reflects a particular normative moral stance, which is that you don't have any sort of fundamental principle or set of principles. You just have this moral standard and that moral standard and that moral standard, and they're sort of autonomous of one another. Like functionally, that's what I act like, but I wouldn't elevate that to the status of being a normative moral theory. Like I don't think particularism is true. I don't even know what that would mean.
Okay, so this is his next question to follow up to that. It seems that you've kind of already answered that, so it's not really related so much to a normative view. Like, what if somebody asks you what a set of principles would be for your moral preferences? What do you say?
Yeah, so I think that we have to be clear on what we mean by principles. So there might be like several main reasons that cause me to hold the particular views that I have. So it might be, for instance, that the normative moral views that I have, the main things that cause me to have them is that they're the sorts of views that I think tend to promote my well-being and the well-being of people I care about. I judge them to be fair in some way that would be hard to articulate. Like there might be some sort of elements that undergird my moral judgments across different scenarios. Like, if you ask my judgments on this issue and that issue and that issue, you could probably find patterns there. And so there may be some patterns underlying them. But what you might find is that there's idiosyncrasies, or the pattern is one that you could project onto my view. You might say, well, these three positions he has, they have something in common. But that doesn't mean that I have those three positions because of some fundamental principle that's causing me to adopt that stance in those three different cases. So if I make a judgment about abortion and euthanasia and people getting tattoos, you could say, it's the underlying principle is bodily autonomy. That's what's causing it. It could just be that I just have this view and that view and that view. They're not caused by the same principles. It's not really about bodily autonomy. It's about something like it's about bodily autonomy in one case, and it's about I just think tattoos are cool in the other case, and then it's about something else in another case. It doesn't just because you could point to a pattern doesn't mean the pattern's causing the normative moral position. So if we're asking a psychological question, why do I care about those things? It doesn't seem like a principle. It's just a cause. If we're asking about a principle, then like it just could just turn out I don't hold it because of that principle. And so once we're clear on what it is we're asking for, sure, of course, there's going to be some psychological explanation for why I have the values I have, but that doesn't mean like I endorse it on normative grounds on reflection. I just don't have principles behind my views. Now, could I have unconscious principles? Maybe, but I don't think so. Sorry if that was kind of a complicated way of addressing the question.
No, that makes sense. So this is slightly related. Yes, of course, the Kant jokes have to come in. Poor Kant, he just can't catch a break. But I think so. There's a historian by the name of Tom Holland, not the guy who plays Spider-Man. And he writes this book I'm reading actually with my Bible study group now called Dominion. And Dominion is about the effect that Christianity had on making the West. Like essentially the Western culture has developed through a Christian lens. Whether you're actually a religious Christian or not is not necessarily relevant to the historical aspect of it. And so that makes me think like how I think, and this is something I'd love to discuss with you one day. It's like how much of the culture, the impact of your upbringing and your culture is determined, like pushes on your moral values and duties. Like especially from an anti-realist perspective, it seems that that's going to play a heavy role. And then maybe there's some Like, are you for the? I know this. We don't have to get into this whole thing, but are you determinist, hard determinist, compatibilist, free will, or you haven't thought about that?
Uh, that's another case where I would say I'm a quietist. So my view
Okay.
is functionally closest to incompatibilists, free
Okay.
will skeptics. So
Okay.
if someone said you got to pick one, then I would just say, yeah, put me in with the free will skeptics and the incompatibilists. But I don't endorse incompatibilism. I think the whole free will dispute is misguided. So if it starts to sound like there's a pattern here, there is. Once you start taking the Wittgensteinian axe to one area of philosophy, it seems like you could reap most of the field, maybe not all of it, and that's starting to happen. I like the quietest dominoes are falling everywhere. So pretty soon you'll see me saying, I reject all the views in this area. I reject all the views in that area. So it's the same sort of thing.
Okay. And the reason I was asking was so that can contribute to what would be influencing, your views, your ethics views. So, like, is it because of cultural? Is it because of the way the neurons are set up in your brain? Because of how of your development as a physical human being, you're because of biology and anatomy, you're more likely to have these views, and like,
Yeah. So
okay.
I do think, there's a whole area of like personality psychology and, individual differences, I think probably do account for why people hold different philosophical views. There's been a little research on this and it hasn't turned up any consistent patterns like extroverts are more likely to do this or that. There's been a little bit of research, but not, it's not very substantial. I think there's been one small finding from quite a few years ago where they found the big five personality traits that I think it was openness to experience was positively correlated with endorsing like relativism or anti-realism, which if true wouldn't be very surprising for reasons that I don't think we have time to get into at this point. But overall, when it comes to philosophers and personality, I think that there are different philosophical temperaments and that there's probably underlying biological and like sociocultural factors behind that. When it comes to morality, a lot of people in the literature and in popular discourse stress evolution, like biological evolution, and constantly talk about evolution caused us to have these or those moral values. I actually, I'm an atheist. I'm all about evolution. I love evolution, but I think a lot of people oversell the degree to which evolution directly influences human moral values. I don't think it directly influences them as much as most people do. I think that if you're looking at humans as an organism and you say, well, what kind of organism humans are? I see humans as a cultural species. We are a species where we reached psychological escape velocity from our evolutionary heritage. We have the ability to completely subvert what you could say is like in organisms, they're biological imperative. Humans can choose to not have children, and they often do. So people could just not care at all about what natural selection directly impels them to do. And you could say, well, whatever we do, it has some sort of selective advantage from a biological point of view. I don't think that's true of humans. I think humans could just act in ways that are not in their own interest from a reproductive perspective. And I think that's because culture can allow human values, goals, attitudes, dispositions to deviate. We have super flexible minds. And I think a great deal of moral variation is subject to cultural change, not just direct evolutionary influences. And it's like, do people forget that there were whole societies where they had like ritual human sacrifice?
Yeah.
There's people that wake up in the morning and they're like, I guess I'm going to sacrifice 6 people today. I physically couldn't do that. I would be horrified and disgusted beyond my ability to even fathom. And yet other human beings, like a few centuries ago, straight up did that. And maybe they suffered horribly when they did it, but I think in many cases people don't. People are able to do horrific stuff and think it's totally morally okay, or even phenomenal. It's fantastic that we sacrificed all these people. So what human moral values can get real warped and very different from our values. And I think that's real scary that humans are capable of going this. Because a lot of people might think, oh, well, they knew deep down it was wrong. I don't think so. I think they thought what they were doing was good. And that makes it 10 times scarier. So yeah, I think culture is a big deal here. For better or worse, I think that's a bigger question than I want to get into here. I think Christianity had a absolutely titanic influence on the psychology of the people that are currently engaged in Anglophone philosophy, myself included. And I think that gets washed out when philosophers talk about things. They act like they're reasoning about humans as though we have a shared universal human nature. But almost all of the people involved in that discussion have had such an enormous influence of Christianity and monotheism that it's the water they swim in. They don't realize how big of an impact it's had on their psychology. Just the very, like we're talking about morality, the very way in which we dichotomize good and evil, I think that dichotomy and the distinctive way in which we think about it in Western philosophy would be vastly different if it weren't for the preeminence of Christianity for the past couple thousand years. The Greeks didn't think about morality in the same way as we do now. They didn't think about free will in the same way. But philosophers act like it's always been this way, and this is how everybody thinks. No, it's not. People from different cultures and societies don't think about morality and free will in the same way. Some may, but some may not.
Yeah, no, and that's the point in Tom Holland's book is we're swimming in those waters, and it's crazy the presuppositions we've grown into that we may not realize. And you, like you just described, have experienced it firsthand. So, last question, and then we'll end the stream. I've always wanted to ask you this. I don't think I've asked you this before. How do you handle, or how do you answer the moral reformer problem?
The moral reformer problem, like the problem for relativists?
So I guess I don't know if it would be a problem for your view, but if somebody says this was a problem I used to ask anti-realist, I still ask them. So how do you handle a Martin Luther King or a Nelson Mandela or something like that?
Right. So like if we put the like what the problem is, the typical problem would be for a culture relativist, if you think that an action or like a person's actions are right or wrong relative to their culture, well, then if a particular culture generally approves of violating civil rights or keeping slaves or something horrible, and a reformer comes along and says, hey, I think this is bad, we should change this. Well, if bad just means bad relative to the culture, it's not bad relative to that culture. So what the heck are they talking about? So that is a problem if you endorse agent culture relativism, because on that view, the moral facts are fixed by whatever considerations cause a particular culture to set the standards for what's morally good or bad for that culture. It could be a majority view. It could be whoever's in a position of authority, like whoever the legal authorities are, whatever it would be. It doesn't have to be strict majority. And so that creates a problem for those views, because the people that hold that view would have to say, to have a consistent position, that reformers in that society are doing something morally wrong, but they don't want to because they agree with the civil rights reforms that have been made. So the inconsistency there is the position seems to commit them to civil rights reform is morally wrong. And then they think, I don't think civil rights reform is morally wrong. So therein lies the problem. But that's only a problem for a very specific type of cultural relativism that I've never endorsed and never found remotely appealing. Gotcha. That's a perspective that fixes the moral facts to the standards of the culture in a way that then applies to everybody. So if you're an agent culture relativist and there's another culture that has some horrific practice like human sacrifice, well, what it means for an action to be morally right or wrong is that it's considered by the people practicing the practice that it's morally right or wrong. So if members of that culture generally consider human sacrifice morally good, then it is in fact morally good for the agent culture relativist. So I would have to go, oh, yeah, well, do they approve of the human sacrifice? Oh, they do? Okay, well, then I guess it's morally good. Why would I think someone else, why would I care about their standards? If you're looking at it from an appraiser relativist perspective, whether an action is right or wrong is judged relative to your standards, like the standards of whoever's evaluating the action.
Right.
And once you adopt that perspective, you have no problem with reformers because you're judging the reformers relative to your standards. So you have this culture that has some bad practice. They violate civil rights. Reformers come along and they say, no, violating civil rights is actually bad. We should change it. And then you're a third party evaluating the whole thing. What you can appreciate is that the people that violated civil rights, it was good relative to their standards. What that means is something like they considered it good to violate civil rights. It does not mean you have to consider it good. For comparison, I can recognize that someone else might like the taste of what is that stuff that that they put on toast in Australia, like Marmite or whatever. That stuff's nasty.
Oh yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? So just because
Yeah.
someone else says, hey, this is good, if I can say as a gastronomic subjectivist, when they say it's tasty relative to their preferences, it doesn't mean I have to find it tasty. It's still gross. And it's the same thing for the appraiser relativist. They could say, sure, like the violating civil rights is like quote unquote good relative to their standards, but it has nothing to do with your own attitudes of approval or disapproval towards the action. You could say, sure, they consider it good, but that's all your relativism commits you to. It doesn't require you to consider it good. You can say, yeah, they consider it good, and I don't. Their violation of civil rights sucks. I hate it. It's morally bad. And then you can say, and I totally agree with the reformers. What they're doing is morally good. I like that. Good, reform it. So that allows you to judge things relative to your standards. You see, so that's the difference between agent and appraiser relativism. The reformer problem's only a problem for agent relativism. In fact, the last video I reviewed, I went over this difference. It was responding to Inspiring Philosophies. Actually, it was 2 videos back.
Yeah.
So the last one was Chapman, I think. So 2 videos back, it was last week. I covered this distinction because a lot of people depict anti-realism in terms of agent relativism. Agent relativism is a ridiculous position. I would never endorse that. No, note a thing about agent relativism. Note what it does. So if another culture practices human sacrifice, you as an agent relativist are obligated to think it's good for them to practice human sacrifice. In what way? Independent of your own preferences, goals, attitudes, and values. Sounds a lot like a type of weird realism. It's kind of like each individual. Yeah, it does, right? Like, because just like realism, moral values are imposed on you by others. So if you're an agent subjectivist and someone runs up to you and says, give me your wallet, like give me all your stuff. And you're like, no, I don't want to. And they're like, no, you don't understand. I think it's good to take your wallet. And now you're an agent relativist. You have to agree with me. If you're an agent relativist, you do have to agree with him. You have to go, crap, it is good for you to take my wallet. Here you go. That's absurd, because if you're a relativist, you'd say, I'm not giving you my wallet because I disapprove. I act on my standards. You act on yours. And on my standards, that's wrong. You could legislate for yourself, but I legislate for me. But agent relativism actually means when a person self-legislates, they legislate for everyone else, independent of their goals and values. That's super weird. I actually jokingly call this a la carte realism, because it actually functions like each person picks what the moral facts are true are for themselves, and then everyone else has to respect them. It's very weird. I've never heard of anybody actually endorsing that. I've seen hints that people are like, well, if that culture practices it, then it's okay. So I take that back. Yeah. I've seen people say that, but I've never heard of like an academic anti-realist endorsing a view like that. So the reformer problem is just not a problem for me. I just judge people relative to my standards. So reformer is good. The rights violator is bad on my view.
That's I can only imagine what you said in your response to IP's video then, because that's probably where I first heard, because he made that a long time ago, but that's probably where I first heard that dilemma and looked more into it. He does that would be a super introductory video if you want to try to critique realism, but I can imagine because I think he presents Cunio's epistemic facts argument in that video. And I used to like that argument. I don't really like that argument so much anymore. I think I've seen you critique that argument before.
Yeah, I don't think it's a very strong argument. I mean, it's very simple to reject that, because I just reject epistemic realism too. So if someone's saying, hey, both positions sink or swim together, the presumption is that you won't want both to sink. And I'm just like, no, sink them both. I don't care.
Right.
You know, I've made fun of it before by someone saying, wow, you don't believe in Bigfoot? Well, if you don't believe in Bigfoot, you'd have to not believe in the Loch Ness Monster. You don't want to do that. And it's like, yeah, this is not a problem. Okay, I don't believe in either of them. Now what? Like, what are they going to do? Oh, so you reject the Mothman? Yes, this is not an issue for me. So yeah, I don't see what that argument's appeal is supposed to be.
Gotcha. Well, I guess he's one of the top 4. Him, Humor. You had the one guy, I can't remember his name. You had a real channel. Yeah.
I don't know who the top are. I don't know how this judged. There's certainly the people that's names come to mind. Is Terence Cunio, Michael Humer, David Enoch, and Russ Schaefer Landau. I don't know what others people would think of right away.
Who does? I can't remember. I guess the Moorian argument comes from Moore, but there's a guy who I watched, went over the argument. It's always wrong to punch an innocent child. I imagine.
Well, there's other people in the space. I've talked to Ben Watkins and Eric Sampson.
Oh, yeah.
There's also
I know you talked to Sampson,
Scanlon,
yeah.
Parfit. I mean, Parfit's not with us anymore, but Parfit is one of the most prominent and well-respected moral realists. Who else? Spencer Case is another realist. Recently put out a book with Matt Lutz, who's an error theorist. That's cool because it's a book of back and forth between a realist and an anti-realist.
Okay.
There's other people I'm not thinking of right now, so I apologize if I didn't.
You're fine.
I didn't mention.
Have you ever engaged with any of David Baggett's work?
I'm familiar with it, so I know he has like an abductive moral argument rather than a deductive one.
Right.
That seems more promising to me than a deductive one. The deductive moral argument, I think, is just not very strong. So, yeah, I've seen him talk about it. I've never read his work.
Gotcha. Okay. I think he has a very, I think he has a strong approach, and it's very modest. I've definitely shied away from the deductive argument. I think that the abductive is a little easier to defend, especially like the William Lane Craig set up. The moral argument: if God exists, then moral values and duties are objective. Moral values and duties are objective, therefore God exists. That's like, man, you're going to spend a long time defending that second premise. So I think that Baggett has a much better approach. But
yeah, I tend to agree. It looks like Baggett really engages with meta ethics, and my sense is doesn't look like Craig really has, and I think that's very unfortunate.
That's not his space. No, I think he does good work on time. That's what I've read most from him is because the Kalam cosmological argument is his baby. He reinvented that from years ago, and so he's written tons on time, and also he's a theologian too, so he has to split his time, writing things like that on the atonement of Christ and other things of that nature. His work on Adam and Eve and his particular view of Genesis being mytho-history. So he does have to split his time, but if anything in philosophy, he's definitely spending most of his time on time. Yeah, no pun intended there. So any last words, anything you want to recommend? And also tell my folks where to find you.
Sure. So I've tried to stick with the same name pretty much everywhere. It's Lance. That's my name, Lance Independent. If it's not clear what it is, someone suggested this to me as a play on the word like stance independent, Lance Independent. So it's a play on words, and it also kind of sounds like a newspaper, like the Lance Independent. So I came up with that name. Oh, well, sorry, they came up with the name and gave me that recommendation. So I never know if they want specific credit by name. I'm happy to throw it in the comments or something. So that's where you can find me, Lance Independent. So I got a blog, I got a YouTube channel. I think you're giving people links to these.
Yes.
I'm on TikTok. I haven't been as active there recently. I'm going to get back into that too. I both post relatively short videos, and I do some streaming there. I haven't been doing it for a while, but I'm going to get back to it. But YouTube and the blog. So yeah, check me out in those places. I got a few published papers out there. So I'm in those places. As far as final words, we didn't get into like my anti-realist views. I'd be happy to talk about those sometime.
Yes.
I'm sure there's plenty to talk about. I'm also happy to talk about religion. One thing, because I finished my dissertation not too long ago. When you're in that zone where you're focusing on that one issue, it's like it takes over your whole world. And as I put it in the rearview mirror, like I'm like, oh, there's other things in the world. I'm like, oh, there's sunlight and other topics. So I've gotten a little bit of an interest in religion. I wouldn't say it's at the top of the list, but I'd be happy to talk about that. And, put myself outside my comfort zone where I'm not going to be as knowledgeable as other people.
Yeah, no, we can definitely try to do another stream where we talk about like more of a strict meta-ethical approach, and then definitely philosophy of religion. That's where I have spent more time in. And again, I really appreciate you coming in. I know meta-ethics is your main gig, and they attempted to stay there, but they didn't stay as usual. They went into the normative ethics. But I think that you gave really good insight, and you defend the anti-realist position the best that I've seen. So I couldn't think of anybody better to bring on. And like all of the Phil bros, online, AMD or J Mike, I'm sure you've spoken with them, and Ruckster, they all value your view for a good reason. I saw you on Joe Schmid too. You did a great job talking to him. He's like the most middle ground of all people, ready to attack both sides. So if you do right by him, you have to be knowing, you have to know what you're talking about to a certain extent. That dude is just like a complete and total genius. It's crazy the stuff he comes
He's
up
on
with.
another level. If I had to, there's like a few people where if I had to go up against them in a debate, or I was on their bad side in an argument, he's one of the people that would terrify me.
Yeah. No, that would be probably the last person I would want to be on anything. Like, I don't understand how he can just look at something and criticize the letter in the first word of the premise. It's
Mhm.
crazy.
I don't
But
have that ability. I'm very narrow. Yeah, he's very impressive.
yeah, I think he actually, I can't remember the name of the philosophy professor, but he did a video on YouTube on Bayesian probability, and a
Mhm.
college professor said, "This is so good, I'm going to make all my students watch this," and
Oh,
that's
that's
now
awesome.
part of his curriculum. So, I mean, for you, if you ever get it when you're if you ever have like any specific topic you want to look for a quick video for explanation, maybe homework, definitely take advantage of his channel. Majesty of Reason is one of the best philosophy channels on YouTube. But other than that, I'll make sure we have all of the links in the description. I know I at least have the YouTube, the blog, and the TikTok. I'll edit it to make sure we have all the stuff that's in your bio over. So make sure you guys check out Lance. Thank you so much again, Lance, for joining the channel. We'll definitely have to have you back. And of course, if any of you guys have any questions, our email is on the description, totapologetics@gmail.com. If you guys have anything you want to talk about, any questions, feel free to reach us. But otherwise, everybody have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time.